Pick up a rock, any rock. Feel its weight in your hand, the texture of its surface, the way it fits against your palm. Now imagine that rock was shaped by human hands 3 million years ago. Someone held it just like you're holding yours. They felt its weight. They turned it over, examining the edges. And they were thinking something. What was it? Fear of the predator they heard in the tall grass? Hope that this tool would help them feed their family? Wonder at their own ability to create something new from stone? We'll never know their exact thoughts, but we know this. That moment when someone picked up a rock and decided to make it into something else, that's when everything changed. Welcome to the Stone Age. Not a single era, not a simple chapter in history, but an epic that spans 99% of human existence. 3 million years. That's not a typo. While we spend hours talking about ancient Rome or medieval castles, while we dedicate entire courses to the last few thousand years of civilization, we often skip over the period that actually made us human. The Stone Age isn't ancient history. It's the foundation of everything. Your brain, your hands, your ability to solve problems, your capacity for language and art and love. All of it was forged during the endless millennia when our ancestors had nothing but stone, wood, and bone. Think about that for a second. Every technological revolution we've had in the last 5,000 years, metals, writing, printing presses, computers, all of it combined represents less than 1% of human technological history. For 99% of our existence, we survived and thrived with tools made from rocks. And somehow, during those millions of years with the simplest technology imaginable, humans spread across the entire planet. We survived ice ages that would terrify us today. We hunted animals that could easily kill us. We developed language complex enough to share knowledge across generations. We created art that still moves us 40,000 years later. The Stone Age is where we became us. Tonight, or this morning, or whenever you're watching this, you're about to take a journey through deep time. We're talking millions of years here. We'll start 3.3 million years ago in East Africa, watching the first ape-like hands shape the first stone tools. We'll follow early humans as they learn to control fire, as they leave Africa and spread across Asia and Europe. We'll survive brutal ice ages alongside Neanderthals and meet the mysterious Denisovans in the mountains of Siberia. We'll witness the birth of art, the first cave paintings, the first sculptures, the first hints of spirituality and symbolic thinking. And if you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. Let your mind drift through millions of years. Let the story carry you from the African savanna to frozen tundra, from the first crude stone choppers to the sophisticated flint blades that would eventually give way to the first metals. Before we go deeper, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love checking in and seeing Berlin at breakfast, Sydney at midnight, Los Angeles at 3 a.m. All of us connected across time zones, thinking about our ancestors who lived across epochs. There's something beautiful about that. Here's what you need to understand before we begin. The Stone Age isn't just about rocks. It's about survival against odds that would break us today. It's about innovation with the simplest materials. It's about humans, lots of different kinds of humans, sharing this planet and competing and sometimes cooperating. For most of the Stone Age, we weren't alone. Neanderthals lived in Europe. Denisovans roamed Asia. Homo erectus held on in isolated pockets. Tiny humans on Indonesian islands. We were just one human species among many. And here's the wildest part. We almost didn't make it. Around 900,000 years ago, there were only about 1,280 humans left alive on the entire planet. Fewer people than a small town. The entire future of humanity, all 8 billion of us today, came from that tiny group of survivors who refused to give up during a climate catastrophe that lasted over 100,000 years. But they did survive. And they didn't just survive, they thrived. They adapted. They invented, they spread, they became us. Over the next few hours, we're going to understand how. How did stone tools change everything? How did fire transform human life? How did our ancestors hunt woolly mammoths and survive winters that lasted years? How did they create art in dark caves by flickering firelight? How did they transition from nomadic hunters to settled farmers? And most importantly, how did 3 million years of living with stone create the modern human mind? By the end of this journey, you'll understand something profound. Those stone-wielding ancestors who huddled around fires in the African night, who painted bison on cave walls in France, who chipped flint points in the Ice Age tundra, they made you possible. Everything you are, everything humanity has become, started with someone picking up a rock and imagining it could be something more. So let's go back, way back, to a world before cities, before farms, before metal, before writing. Back to the dawn of the Paleolithic, back to when apes became toolmakers and the human story truly began. Before we get to those 1,280 survivors who nearly went extinct before the dramatic bottleneck that forged modern humanity, there was something else. Something older, something that started so quietly, so unremarkably, that if you'd been there to witness it, you probably wouldn't have thought it mattered at all. 3.3 million years ago, Kenya, the shores of Lake Turkana, some creature, we don't even know what species, picked up a rock, not to throw it, not as a weapon, but to strike it against another rock, deliberately, with intention. And in that moment, everything changed. We found the evidence in 2015. A team of archaeologists working near Lomekwi, Kenya, uncovered stone tools that were older than anything we'd ever discovered. 3.3 million years old. Large, crude stone flakes and cores that showed unmistakable signs of intentional shaping. Someone had sat there, chosen specific rocks, and struck them together in a way that created sharp edges. Here's what makes this discovery so mind-bending. These tools are 700,000 years older than our genus, Homo. They predate the earliest known members of our own evolutionary branch by 750,000 years. We call them the Lomekwi tools, and they tell us something profound and unsettling. Tool use didn't make us human. Something not yet human was already making tools. So who did it? We don't know for certain, but the best candidate is Australopithecus. Maybe Australopithecus afarensis, the same species as Lucy, that famous skeleton found in Ethiopia. Or possibly another Australopithecine species that happened to be living in East Africa at the time. Picture them, not humans, not even close. They stood maybe 4 feet tall, with brains about a third the size of yours. Their faces jutted forward, ape-like. Their arms were still long, adapted for climbing trees. They were more comfortable in the branches than on the ground, but they walked upright. That's the crucial part. And when you walk upright, your hands are free. Free to carry things, free to manipulate objects, free to experiment, and the world was giving them reasons to experiment. Africa, 3.3 million years ago, was in the middle of a transformation that would last millions of years, a transformation that created us. The climate was shifting, not in a steady, predictable way, but in wild oscillations. Periods of heavy rainfall would give way to devastating droughts. The dense forests that had covered much of East Africa were fragmenting, breaking apart into scattered woodland islands separated by expanding grasslands. This was a crisis for tree-dwelling apes. The forests were shrinking. The safe, familiar world of the canopy was disappearing, replaced by open savannas where predators could see you from miles away. Most ape species retreated to whatever forest remained, clinging to the old ways, the old habitats. They eventually went extinct, unable to adapt when their refuges finally disappeared. But a few populations did something different. They stayed at the edges, in the mosaic environments where forest met grassland, and they started experimenting with a new lifestyle. More time on the ground, more time in the open, more interaction with a world that was dangerous but also full of opportunities. The grasslands were expanding and with them came vast herds of grazing animals, antelopes, ancient horses, early elephants. Where there were grazers, there were predators, big cats, hyenas, wild dogs. And where there were predators making kills, there were leftovers. A lion pride takes down a wildebeest, feeds for hours, and leaves. The carcass still has meat on it, but it's protected by thick hide and guarded by bones that smaller scavengers can't break. Inside those bones is marrow, rich in fats and nutrients. Inside the skull is a brain, calories that most animals can't access, unless you have a tool. That first Australopithecus who picked up a rock and struck it against another wasn't following a divine plan or experiencing a moment of transcendent enlightenment. They were probably hungry. Maybe they'd found a carcass and were frustrated by their inability to get at the good parts. Maybe they'd seen rocks naturally fractured by geological processes and noticed the sharp edges. Maybe it was accident, or curiosity, or desperation. But they made that connection. Sharp stone can cut through hide. Heavy stone can smash open bone. And once that connection was made, it could be repeated, refined, taught. This is the part that matters. Not the first tool, but the second, the third, the 100th. Because each time someone made a tool, they were doing something that required abilities most animals don't have. Memory. You have to remember that sharp stones can cut meat. That might seem obvious now, but it's not. It requires forming an abstract connection between an object and its potential uses. Planning. You have to think ahead. Find a good rock before you need it. Recognize that something you're doing now will be useful later. Learning. Nobody is born knowing how to fracture stone to create a sharp edge. You have to learn it, either by watching someone else or through trial and error, which means you need patience and the ability to persist through failure. Teaching. If knowledge dies with each individual, tool use would never spread beyond a few rare geniuses. But if you can teach your children, if they can watch you and learn to imitate, then the knowledge accumulates. Each generation can build on what the previous one discovered. The Lomekwi tools were crude, large cores and flakes, heavy and unrefined. But they worked. And for hundreds of thousands of years, this was enough. Then, 2.6 million years ago, something shifted again. The climate was getting even more variable. The grasslands were expanding faster. The old Australopithecine lifestyle of part-time tree dwelling and part-time ground foraging was becoming less viable. You had to choose, trees or ground, forest or savanna. And in that pressure, a new strategy emerged. The Oldowan industry, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania where the first examples were found. These weren't just random rocks smashed together. These were stone tools made according to a technique, a method that could be replicated and improved upon. An Oldowan toolmaker would select a core stone, usually lava rock or chert, something that fractured in predictable ways. They'd hold it steady and strike it with another stone, a hammerstone, at just the right angle. The impact would send a shockwave through the core, and if everything was right, if the angle was correct and the force was calibrated and the stone was the right type, a flake would detach. That flake had a sharp edge, sharper than any tooth or claw, sharp enough to slice through the toughest hide, to butcher meat, to scrape hides, to work wood. The process could be repeated, taking flake after flake from the core until it was too small to work with. Then you'd start over with a new core. This might sound simple, but try it. Go find 2 rocks and try to produce a sharp flake. Most people can't do it without training. You need to understand the properties of stone, the angles of percussion, the amount of force required. It's a skill that takes hours of practice to develop, and 2.6 million years ago someone was teaching this skill, passing it down, creating a tradition. We know the Oldowan industry emerged in Africa, probably East Africa, in that same crucible of environmental change that had sparked the first experiments 700,000 years earlier. But we're not entirely sure who was making these improved tools. The timing coincides with the emergence of the genus Homo. The earliest members of our own evolutionary branch, probably Homo habilis, handy man. They had slightly larger brains than the Australopithecines, more human-like body proportions, and they were better adapted for walking long distances across open country. But here's the uncomfortable truth. We can't be certain they were the only tool makers. Australopithecines were still around. Paranthropus, another early human relative with massive jaws for processing tough plant materials, was present. Multiple species of bipedal apes were living in the same regions at the same time. It's possible they were all using tools, learning from each other, competing for resources, living in a world much more crowded with human-like intelligence than we usually imagine. What we do know is that Oldowan tools transformed survival strategies. With these tools, early humans could exploit carcasses far more efficiently. They could cut through hide, dismember joints, extract marrow. They could process meat faster, which meant less time spent vulnerable at a kill site. They could carry meat away to safer locations, sharing it with others. This access to high-quality animal protein created a feedback loop. Better nutrition meant healthier children. Healthier children were more likely to survive to adulthood. And meat provides the kinds of fats and nutrients that support brain growth. Larger brains are metabolically expensive. Your brain right now is using about 20% of your body's energy, despite being only 2% of your body weight. For early humans to support even slightly larger brains, they needed reliable access to calorie-dense foods. Tools provided that access, not just to meat, but to other resources. Sharp flakes could process plant materials more efficiently. They could dig up roots and tubers. They could work wood to create pointed sticks for digging or defending against predators. Every technological improvement created new opportunities, and every opportunity selected for intelligence, for individuals who could learn faster, remember better, plan further ahead. But something else was happening too, something social. A stone tool doesn't appear fully formed. It has to be made, and making it requires time and attention. The toolmaker is vulnerable during that time, focused on their work, less aware of predators. In a dangerous environment, you can't afford to be distracted unless someone is watching your back. This implies cooperation, trust, social structures where individuals looked out for each other while someone engaged in specialized tasks. It also implies teaching. Oldowan tools show remarkable consistency across vast areas and long time periods. Sites separated by hundreds of miles and thousands of years show the same basic techniques. This isn't coincidence. This is cultural transmission. Knowledge being passed deliberately from one generation to the next. Think about what that means. A mother teaching her child to make tools, not just through passive observation, but through active instruction, demonstrating the technique, correcting mistakes, encouraging practice. This is language. Maybe not spoken language as we know it, not yet, but definitely communication complex enough to convey abstract concepts. Strike here, not so hard. Watch the angle. For over 1 million years, this was the state of human technology. The Oldowan industry, remarkably stable, remarkably successful. Stone tools that were good enough to support spreading populations across Africa. But why Africa? Why did this continent become the birthplace of human innovation? Geography, climate, resources. Africa had them all. The Great Rift Valley, that massive geological scar running through East Africa, created a landscape of incredible diversity. Lakes, rivers, mountains, grasslands, forests, all packed into a relatively small area. Early humans could exploit multiple environments without travelling vast distances. The climate variability forced adaptation. Populations couldn't rely on any single resource or strategy. They had to be flexible, innovative, capable of switching tactics when conditions changed. This constant pressure selected for intelligence and behavioural flexibility. And Africa had megafauna, huge animals that provided abundant calories if you could figure out how to access them. Elephants, hippos, various species of antelope. These animals created opportunities for anyone clever enough to exploit them. Other continents had resources too, but they didn't have this combination. The dense mosaic of environments, the climate variability, the abundance of large animals, and the geographical accessibility. Africa was a perfect laboratory for human evolution. But here's the real mystery, the one that haunts every archaeologist and anthropologist who studies this period. When did consciousness emerge? When did shaping stone become shaping thought? An Australopithecus making those crude Lamechwi tools 3.3 million years ago, what was going on in their mind? Were they aware of what they were doing in any meaningful sense? Or were they just following instincts, behaviours that felt right but weren't consciously understood? What about the Oldowan toolmakers a million years later? When they carefully selected a core stone, tested it for quality, worked it with practice skill, were they thinking in a way we'd recognise as thought? Were they imagining the tool they wanted to create before they created it? We don't know. Consciousness doesn't fossilise. We can only infer its presence from behaviour, and behaviour can be deceiving. But somewhere in those 1.3 million years between the Lamechwi tools and the Oldowan industry, something changed. The brain size was increasing. The tools were becoming more sophisticated. The social structures were becoming more complex. And with each generation, with each small improvement in tool-making technique or social cooperation, the selective pressure for intelligence was intensifying. By 2 million years ago, Africa was home to creatures that walked upright, made tools, shared food, and taught their children complex skills. They weren't modern humans. They weren't even the same species that would eventually become modern humans. But they were on the path. They had crossed a threshold that no other species had crossed. They had begun to shape their environment deliberately, to create objects that existed only because they imagined them first. They were no longer just another African ape trying to survive. They were something new, something that would eventually spread across the entire planet, transforming every environment they encountered. They were the first humans, and they were about to do something that would change everything. They were about to leave Africa. Around 2 million years ago, something new walked onto the African savannah. Not just another ape with slightly better tools, not just another evolutionary dead end destined to vanish after a few 100,000 years. This was something different, something that would change the rules of the game entirely. Meet Homo erectus, the first human that would actually recognize itself as human. Stand one next to you and the differences from earlier hominins would be immediately obvious. They're tall, some individuals reaching nearly 6 feet. Their bodies are lean and long-limbed, built for efficient walking and running across open landscapes. The stooped, ape-like posture of their ancestors is gone. These are creatures designed for endurance, for covering vast distances, for living in ways no primate had ever lived before. But the real difference isn't visible, it's in their heads. Homo erectus had brains averaging 900 cubic centimetres, substantially larger than their predecessors. Not quite modern human size yet, but getting there. More importantly, their brains were organised differently. Enhanced areas for language processing, improved spatial reasoning, better memory. These weren't just slightly smarter apes. These were creatures capable of planning, abstract thinking, complex social coordination. And they proved it with a tool that would become the longest-running design success in human history, the Acheulean hand axe. Pick one up and you're holding something that feels impossibly right in your hand. Teardrop-shaped, carefully flaked on both sides to create a symmetrical cutting edge. It's sharp enough to butcher a carcass, strong enough to dig roots, versatile enough to use for a dozen different tasks. But here's what makes it remarkable. This design remained essentially unchanged for over 1.5 million years. Think about that. Modern humans went from the first powered flight to landing on the moon in 66 years. We went from room-sized computers to smartphones in a single generation. But Homo erectus made the same style of hand axe for 1.5 million years. Generation after generation after generation, passing down the exact same technology. That's not because they were uncreative or cognitively limited. It's because they had achieved something close to perfection. The Achillean hand axe was so effective, so perfectly suited to the needs of early humans, that there was no evolutionary pressure to improve it. When archaeologists find these hand axes, they find them everywhere Homo erectus went. Africa, Europe, Asia. The same design, repeated across 3 continents over more than 1 million years. This is the signature of true culture, of knowledge being transmitted not through genes, but through teaching and learning. But Homo erectus didn't just improve tool technology. They did something no hominin had ever done before. They left Africa. Around 1.9 million years ago, the first Homo erectus populations began moving out of their ancestral homeland. Not in one dramatic exodus, but gradually, following game animals, exploring new territories, pushing boundaries that had confined every previous human species. Within a few 100,000 years, they had spread across the Middle East into Asia. By 1.5 million years ago, they had reached as far as modern-day China and Indonesia. This wasn't migration in the modern sense. These weren't people packing up and deliberately relocating to distant lands. This was range expansion, each generation moving a little further than the last, establishing new territories, adapting to new environments. But the cumulative result was staggering. Within 500,000 years of leaving Africa, Homo erectus had colonized more territory than all previous human species combined. What made this possible? How did a tropical African species manage to survive in the temperate forests of Europe, the seasonal monsoons of Asia, the volcanic islands of Indonesia? The answer is fire. Somewhere between 1.5 million and 1 million years ago, Homo erectus learned to control fire. Not just opportunistically use it when lightning strikes created natural blazes. Not just carry it from place to place and try to keep it burning, but actually create it, maintain it, use it as a tool. This might be the single most important technological breakthrough in human history. More important than agriculture, more important than writing, more important than the wheel. Fire changed everything. The earliest controversial evidence comes from Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, where archaeologists have found what might be controlled fires dating to 1 million years ago. Burned bones, ash deposits in specific locations, stones showing heat damage. The pattern suggests deliberate fire use, hearths maintained in the same spots over extended periods. But the evidence is debated. Natural fires can create similar patterns, and proving human control from million-year-old ash is nearly impossible. More convincing evidence comes from Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, dated to around 790,000 years ago. Here the evidence is clearer. Concentrated ash deposits, burned seeds and wood, fire-cracked rocks arranged in patterns that suggest hearth construction. This wasn't just using fire. This was fire management, systematic and sustained. But regardless of exactly when it happened, the consequences were revolutionary. First, fire extended the day. Before fire, humans were like every other primate, active during daylight hours and vulnerable at night. Darkness meant danger, meant retreating to trees or caves and hoping predators didn't find you. Fire changed that calculation. A burning fire keeps predators at bay. Lions, hyenas, leopards, all the nighttime hunters that had terrorized human ancestors for millions of years, they fear fire instinctively. A group of Homo erectus around a campfire could sleep safely through the night, could extend their active hours into darkness, could effectively add several hours of useful time to each day. Second, fire provided warmth. This is what made the expansion into temperate and cold climates possible. A tropical species with no thick fur, no hibernation capability, no natural adaptations to cold could suddenly survive freezing winters. As long as they could maintain fire, they could push into territories no primate had ever occupied. The archaeological record shows exactly this pattern. Homo erectus sites in northern China and Europe appear shortly after the first evidence of controlled fire use. The two developments were connected. Third, fire-enabled cooking, and this might have been the most important consequence of all. Raw food is hard to digest. Your body has to work intensely to break down tough plant fibers and raw meat, extracting whatever nutrients it can. Cooking does much of this work externally. Heat breaks down cellular structures, denatures proteins, makes nutrients more accessible. Cooked food provides more calories for less digestive effort. The implications for brain evolution are profound. Brains are expensive organs. A human brain represents about 2% of body weight, but consumes roughly 20% of the body's energy at rest. Supporting a large brain requires reliable access to high-quality calories. Cooking provided exactly that. With cooked food, Homo erectus could extract more energy from the same amount of food, or get adequate nutrition from less food. Either way, more calories became available to fuel brain growth. Some researchers think this created a positive feedback loop. Bigger brains allowed more sophisticated fire management and cooking techniques. Better cooking provided more calories to support even bigger brains. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this cycle drove the dramatic increase in brain size that characterizes human evolution. But fire provided something else, something less tangible, but equally important. It created a focal point for social life. Picture an evening 800,000 years ago. A group of Homo erectus has made camp in a rock shelter. The sun is setting. One member of the group feeds the fire, adding carefully selected wood to keep it burning through the night. Others are preparing food using hand axes to butcher the remains of an antelope killed that afternoon. Children play at the edge of the firelight, learning through observation how to make tools, how to prepare food, how to maintain the fire that keeps everyone safe. As darkness falls, the group gathers closer to the flames. Someone tells a story, maybe about the hunt, maybe about encounters with a rival group. Others listen, laugh, contribute their own versions. Knowledge is shared, relationships are strengthened. Children learn the accumulated wisdom of their elders. This is culture in action. Fire created a space and time for social interaction that hadn't existed before. It transformed human social organization from small foraging groups that dispersed at nightfall into cohesive communities that could maintain complex social bonds. The archaeological evidence for this social transformation is indirect but compelling. Starting around 1 million years ago, Homo erectus sites show evidence of home bases, specific locations where groups returned repeatedly, maintained fires, processed food, and manufactured tools. These aren't temporary camping spots. They're the first hints of something like home, places where social groups maintain stable presence over extended periods. The sites also show evidence of food sharing on a scale not seen in other primates. Large animal bones with cut marks from stone tools, found alongside hearths and tool-making areas, suggest systematic butchery and distribution of meat. Someone killed the animal, others helped process it, everyone shared in the results. This requires trust, reciprocity, the kind of complex social contracts that define human societies. But perhaps most remarkably, Homo erectus sites show evidence of care for the injured and disabled. Fossils have been found of individuals who survived injuries that would have been fatal without group support. A Homo erectus from Dmanisi in Georgia shows evidence of having lost all their teeth years before death, meaning they survived for extended periods unable to chew food properly. Someone had to prepare soft food for them. Someone had to care enough to keep them alive when they could no longer contribute to the group's survival. This is empathy. This is the foundation of morality, the recognition that other individuals have value beyond their immediate utility. And it appears first in Homo erectus, not because they were somehow morally superior, but because their social organization and technology finally made such care possible. But as Homo erectus spread across the world, they encountered challenges that tested every adaptation they had developed. Moving into northern climates meant dealing with seasonal extremes unlike anything in Africa. Harsh winters when plant foods disappeared and animals migrated or hibernated. Brief summers of abundance that had to sustain the group through months of scarcity. They adapted. Homo erectus developed seasonal hunting strategies, learning to predict animal migrations, to cache food for winter use, to exploit a wider range of resources than their tropical ancestors. In China, archaeological sites show evidence of sophisticated hunting of large game animals, coordinated group efforts that required planning and communication. In Europe, they pushed the boundaries of human habitation into regions that experienced harsh glacial conditions. Sites in Spain and Italy dating to 800,000 years ago show Homo erectus surviving in landscapes that were frozen for months at a time. They were using caves as shelters, maintaining fires through long winters, hunting the massive herbivores that grazed the glacial grasslands. But here's the mystery that has puzzled paleoanthropologists for decades. Why did Homo erectus last so long? Most species exist for a few 100,000 years, maybe 1 million at most, before either going extinct or evolving into something else. But Homo erectus persisted with remarkably little change for nearly 2 million years. The earliest specimens from Africa and the latest fossils from Asia, separated by 1.5 million years of evolution, are still recognizably the same species. This isn't because evolution stopped. It's because Homo erectus had achieved something extraordinary. They had become generalist survivors, capable of adapting to virtually any terrestrial environment through behavior and technology rather than biological evolution. When conditions changed, they didn't need to evolve new physical adaptations. They just needed to develop new tools, new hunting strategies, new social organizations. This is the signature of human evolution. We stopped adapting to our environment and started adapting our environment to us. Fire, tools, clothing, shelter. These cultural adaptations could change much faster than biological evolution. When the climate shifted, when resources changed, when new challenges emerged, Homo erectus didn't wait for natural selection to provide solutions over hundreds of thousands of years. They innovated, experimented, shared knowledge. They solved problems culturally within a few generations. This flexibility, this ability to adapt through culture rather than biology, is what allowed them to spread across 3 continents and persist for 2 million years. It's also what set the stage for everything that came after. Because Homo erectus wasn't the end of the story, they were the foundation. The populations that spread across Africa, Europe, and Asia would eventually diverge, encountering different environments, facing different challenges, developing different solutions. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these isolated populations would evolve into new species. Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and eventually, from an African population of Homo erectus, something entirely new, us. But that transformation was still hundreds of thousands of years away. For now, Homo erectus ruled the world. From tropical Africa to frozen Europe to the volcanic islands of Indonesia, they had proven that humans could survive anywhere. That with the right tools, the right social organization, and the controlled fire, primates could become masters of their environment rather than its victims. They had discovered the formula for human success, and it would carry their descendants to the ends of the earth. Here's something that should fundamentally change how you think about being human. For most of our species history, we weren't alone. The planet wasn't just home to Homo sapiens. It was home to multiple human species, all living at the same time, all competing for resources, all developing their own cultures and technologies, all fundamentally, recognizably human. This is hard to wrap your head around if you're used to thinking of humanity as singular. But for hundreds of thousands of years, being human meant being part of a diverse family. A family that included cousins you could meet, trade with, fight with, maybe even fall in love with. Other humans who looked different, thought differently, but shared enough of your biology that you could produce viable offspring together. The world between 400,000 and 40,000 years ago was crowded with humanity. And the story of how we went from many human species to just one is one of the most fascinating and disturbing chapters in our entire evolutionary history. Let's start with the species you've probably heard of, the Neanderthals, and let's immediately destroy the biggest myth about them. They weren't stupid. They weren't brutish cavemen too dumb to compete with superior modern humans. That's Victorian-era propaganda that still infects our popular imagination. The truth is so much more interesting and so much more unsettling. Neanderthals were sophisticated humans who thrived in Ice Age Europe and Western Asia for over 300,000 years. That's 6 times longer than modern humans have existed as a distinct species. They weren't some failed evolutionary experiment. They were wildly successful, perfectly adapted to their environment, and in some measurable ways they were actually more impressive than the ancestors of modern humans. Start with their brains. Neanderthal skulls show cranial capacities averaging 1,500 cubic centimeters. Modern human brains average 1,350. Now, brain size isn't everything, but it's not nothing either. Neanderthals had larger visual cortexes, probably because they needed to process information in the dim light of Ice Age winters. They had robust bodies with muscle attachments that suggest strength that would be exceptional even among modern athletes. Their bones show repeated stress injuries, the kind you get from decades of intense physical activity. But forget the physical stats for a moment. Look at what they created. Look at what they did. Neanderthals developed what archaeologists call Mousterian technology, named after the Le Moustier site in France where it was first identified. These weren't crude stone choppers. These were carefully crafted, purpose-built tools created using a technique called level wire preparation. Here's how it worked. A Neanderthal toolmaker would select a suitable piece of flint. They'd carefully strike flakes from around the edges, shaping the core into a precise geometric form like a turtle shell. Then, with a single, perfectly placed blow, they'd detach a flake that was already the right shape for a spear point or scraper. No further modification needed. This is insane technical skill. You can't do this by accident. You have to visualize the final product before you start. You have to understand the internal structure of stone, how force propagates through crystalline matrices, where to strike and how hard. Modern experimental archaeologists spend years learning these techniques. Neanderthals taught them to their children. But that's just the beginning. In 2017, researchers discovered that Neanderthals were making compound adhesives to haft stone points to wooden spears. Not just any adhesive, but birch bark tar. You know how you make birch bark tar? You have to heat birch bark to exactly the right temperature in an oxygen-free environment. Too hot, and it burns. Too much air, and it oxidizes. Get it right, and you produce a sticky resin that's stronger than modern synthetic glues for certain applications. This requires fire. Control so precise it borders on chemistry. You need to maintain specific temperatures for hours. You need to understand that absence of oxygen matters, which means you need some theoretical model of what fire actually is. This isn't just using fire. This is understanding fire. And they were doing this 200,000 years ago. The archaeological record gets even more remarkable when you look at Neanderthal sites from their last 50,000 years. We find evidence of symbolic behavior. Pierced shells and animal teeth clearly used as jewelry or decorative objects. Pigments, ochres, and manganese dioxide, transported over long distances and processed for use as body paint or artistic materials. Cave sites in Spain showing deliberate arrangements of stalagmites in geometric patterns, dated to 175,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before modern humans arrived in Europe. Most hauntingly, we find they're dead. Neanderthals buried their deceased, not always, not in every group, but regularly enough that it can't be coincidence. The La Ferracie site in France contains 7 Neanderthal burials, including 3 children placed in carefully dug graves. The Shanidar cave in Iraq yielded remains of a Neanderthal male buried with what appeared to be flowers, though this interpretation remains controversial. But here's what's not controversial. These burials show deliberate placement, bodies positioned in specific ways. Sometimes grave goods included, stone tools or animal bones placed with the deceased. This is symbolic thinking. This is the ability to conceive of death as something meaningful, something that requires ritual response. This is spirituality. So who were the Neanderthals really? They were humans who evolved in Ice Age Europe from earlier Homo heidelbergensis populations around 400,000 years ago. They adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth, glacial Europe, where winters lasted 8 months and summers were brief and unpredictable. They survived by becoming the most effective large game hunters in human history. Neanderthal hunting sites show evidence of systematic planned kills. They didn't just opportunistically scavenge or chase down weak animals. They studied migration patterns. They identified kill zones, narrow valleys or cliff edges where large animals could be trapped. They coordinated group hunts, driving woolly rhinoceros and mammoth toward waiting hunters with thrusting spears. Their skeletons show they paid a price for this hunting strategy. Nearly every Neanderthal skeleton shows healed fractures, especially on the upper body and head. Researchers have pointed out that the injury pattern closely matches what you see in modern rodeo professionals, people who wrestle large animals for a living. Neanderthals were getting close to their prey, really close enough to deliver killing blows with handheld spears, close enough to get trampled, gored, and battered regularly. But they survived these injuries. Healed fractures mean the injured individual received care. Someone fed them while they recovered. Someone protected them from predators. Someone valued their continued existence enough to invest resources in their survival. This is compassion. This is community. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals had been living in Europe for over 250,000 years. They had weathered multiple ice ages. They had developed rich cultural traditions that varied by region, suggesting different Neanderthal groups had their own local customs and technologies. They were not on their way out. They were thriving. And then modern humans arrived. But Neanderthals weren't the only other humans on the planet. While they dominated Europe and Western Asia, a mysterious sister species was doing the same across the vast expanse of Asia, the Denisovans. And here's what makes the Denisovan story absolutely wild. We barely have any fossils. The first Denisovan remains were discovered in 2010 in Denisova Cave in Siberia. A single finger bone and a couple of teeth. That's it. That's all we had for years. But from that tiny finger bone, geneticists extracted DNA. And when they sequenced that DNA, they realized they'd found a previously unknown human species. The Denisovan genome showed they'd diverged from Neanderthals about 400,000 years ago, around the same time both species were splitting from the ancestors of modern humans. But unlike Neanderthals, whose remains are found all over Europe, Denisovan fossils were mysteriously absent. One site, a handful of bone fragments. How could an entire human species leave so little physical trace? Then researchers started looking in a different place. Not in the ground, but in the DNA of living people. And that's when the story exploded. Denisovan DNA shows up in modern human populations across Asia, Melanesia, and Australia. Not just trace amounts, some populations carry up to 5% Denisovan ancestry. This means that Denisovans weren't some isolated group that went extinct in Siberia. They were spread across the largest continent on Earth. Modern Tibetans carry a Denisovan gene variant called EPAS1 that helps them process oxygen in the thin air of the Himalayan plateau. This gene is almost completely absent in lowland populations, but nearly universal above 4,000 meters. The Denisovans who lived in high-altitude regions evolved this adaptation, and when they interbred with the ancestors of modern Tibetans, they passed it on. Today, that ancient Denisovan gene is helping people survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Modern Papuans and Aboriginal Australians carry different Denisovan gene variants, ones that seem to help with immune function in tropical environments. This suggests they interbred with a different population of Denisovans, ones adapted to lowland tropical regions rather than high-altitude cold zones. Multiple Denisovan populations, multiple interbreeding events. A species that range from Siberia to Southeast Asia, adapting to radically different environments. And we know all this from a finger bone and DNA analysis. In 2019, researchers identified a Denisovan jawbone from a cave in Tibet, confirming they lived at high altitudes. In 2021, genetic analysis of sediments from various Asian caves showed Denisovan DNA in locations thousands of miles apart. The picture emerging is of a highly successful, geographically widespread human species that was innovative and adaptable enough to thrive across the full range of Asian environments. Some researchers think Denisovans might have been the first humans to develop sophisticated maritime technology. There's evidence they reached islands in Southeast Asia, places like Flores and New Guinea, that would have required crossing significant ocean barriers. This implies boats, navigation skills, planning for multi-day journeys out of sight of land. If true, Denisovans were engaging in behaviours we typically associate with modern humans thousands of years before Homo sapiens developed similar capabilities. They weren't less advanced cousins, they were pioneers. But Neanderthals and Denisovans weren't the only other humans sharing the planet. There were others. Species we're still discovering, still trying to understand. Homo naledi, discovered in South Africa in 2013, shows a bizarre mix of primitive and advanced features. Small brain, less than half the size of ours, but hands capable of precision grip. Feet built for long-distance walking, and most remarkably, evidence they were deliberately disposing of their dead in a deep cave system. This is ritual behaviour from a small-brained human that might have lived as recently as 250,000 years ago. Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit, discovered in Indonesia in 2003. Adults stood about 3.5 feet tall with brains the size of grapefruits. They evolved their small size through island dwarfism, a process where large animals evolve smaller body sizes when trapped on islands with limited resources. But despite their tiny brains, they made sophisticated stone tools and hunted dwarf elephants. They survived on Flores until at least 50,000 years ago, meaning they overlapped with modern humans in the region. There are others we know even less about. Homo luzonensis from the Philippines, known from a handful of bones dated to 50,000 years ago. Possible Homo heidelbergensis populations surviving in various African regions until 200,000 years ago. Mystery hominins whose DNA shows up in modern African populations, suggesting there were species in Africa that we haven't identified yet from fossils. Between 400,000 and 40,000 years ago, the Earth was full of different kinds of humans. Some were close cousins, similar enough to interbreed. Others were more distant relatives, products of evolutionary lineages that had diverged millions of years earlier. But all were recognizably human. All made tools, all used fire, all had complex social structures, and they weren't living in separate worlds. Their ranges overlapped. They encountered each other. We know this because of the genetic evidence. When scientists first sequenced the Neanderthal genome in 2010, they discovered something shocking. Most modern humans of European and Asian descent carry 1–2% Neanderthal DNA. This means our ancestors didn't just encounter Neanderthals, they mated with them, produced viable offspring who survived and reproduced and passed on Neanderthal genes that are still with us today. The interbreeding wasn't just between modern humans and Neanderthals. In 2018, researchers analysed a bone fragment from Denisova Cave and discovered it belonged to a teenage girl whose mother was Neanderthal and father was Denisovan. This wasn't just interbreeding, this was a hybrid, proof that different human species were meeting, interacting, forming relationships across species boundaries. The genetic data shows multiple interbreeding events at different times and places. Modern humans leaving Africa 60,000 years ago met and interbred with Neanderthals in the Middle East. Later waves of modern humans interbred with different Neanderthal populations in Europe, Modern humans moving into Asia encountered multiple Denisovan populations and interbred with them at different times. This wasn't rare. This wasn't exceptional. This was happening regularly enough that most people alive today carry genes from at least one other human species. Think about what this means. When a group of modern humans encountered a group of Neanderthals, what happened? Sometimes they probably fought, competing for the same hunting territories or resources. Sometimes they probably traded, exchanging tools or materials that weren't available in their own regions. Sometimes they formed alliances, temporary partnerships against common threats, and sometimes they fell in love, or at least found each other attractive enough to produce children together. What was it like to be that Neanderthal Denisovan hybrid girl? She grew up 90,000 years ago in a cave in Siberia. Her mother looked one way, stocky and robust with distinctive Neanderthal features. Her father looked different, carried Denisovan traits we can only guess at. Did she look like her mother or her father? Did she feel like she belonged in her community? Did other children treat her differently because she was mixed? We'll never know the answers to these questions, but the fact that we can ask them, the fact that we have evidence of individual human beings navigating the complexities of identity and belonging 90,000 years ago should fundamentally change how we think about our past. These weren't savages. These weren't proto-humans waiting to be replaced by something better. These were people with families and communities and individual life stories. People who faced the same basic challenges we face, figuring out who they were and where they belonged. And then, between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, most of them disappeared. The Neanderthals went extinct. The Denisovans vanished. Homo floresiensis disappeared from their island refuges. Homo naledi, if they'd survived that long, were gone. One by one, all the other human species died out, until only one remained. Us, Homo sapiens, the last human standing. What happened? Why did we survive when all our cousins went extinct? The honest answer is we don't fully know. Climate change played a role. The world was getting colder and more unpredictable. Competition with modern humans certainly mattered, though whether through direct conflict or simply outcompeting for resources remains debated. Disease might have been a factor. Modern humans carrying pathogens that devastated populations with no immunity. But here's the haunting part. It didn't have to be this way. There's nothing inevitable about modern humans being the sole survivors. Neanderthals were thriving until we showed up. Denisovans had successfully adapted to every environment in Asia. The other species were holding their own in their respective territories. We didn't win because we were better. We won because of a combination of luck, timing, and perhaps some small advantages in social organization or technological innovation that compounded over thousands of years. And we didn't completely replace them. We absorbed them. Those Neanderthal genes in your DNA, they're not just random genetic noise. Many of them provide real advantages. Immune system genes that help fight off pathogens. Genes affecting skin and hair adapted to different climates. Genes influencing everything from metabolism to mood regulation. The other human species aren't truly extinct. They're still here, fragments of their genomes living on inside us. Every time someone with European ancestry fights off an infection, there's a chance they're using an immune gene inherited from a Neanderthal ancestor. Every time a Tibetan climbs high into the Himalayas without altitude sickness, they're using a Denisovan adaptation. We are not pure Homo sapiens. We are hybrids, the products of hundreds of thousands of years of interbreeding between multiple human species. We are the species that remain distinct enough to keep our identity, but flexible enough to adopt useful genes from our cousins when we met them. And that's what makes this period of human history so crucial to understand. For most of our time on this planet, humanity was diverse. Multiple species, multiple ways of being human. The fact that we now exist as a single species is a recent and unusual development. For 360,000 of the 400,000 years covered in this section, Being human meant being part of a family with many branches. Now there's only one branch left, and whether that's a triumph or a tragedy depends on how you look at it. But what's undeniable is this: we lost something when the last Neanderthal died, when the last Denisovan closed their eyes for the final time. We lost the chance to learn from them, to understand different ways of being human. We lost the richness that comes from diversity, but we also gained something. We gained their genes, their innovations, their hard-won adaptations to environments we'd never encountered. We became a fusion species, carrying within us the survival wisdom of multiple human lineages, and we were about to need every bit of that wisdom. Because the world was getting colder, the ice was advancing, and the real test of human survival was just beginning. You need to understand something about the world your ancestors inhabited. It wasn't stable, it wasn't predictable, and it absolutely wasn't friendly. For the past 2.6 million years, Earth had been locked in what geologists call the Pleistocene, a geological epoch defined by one simple, terrifying reality: ice. Massive continental glaciers advancing and retreating like cosmic breathing. Except each breath lasted tens of thousands of years, and every exhale could kill you. The climate didn't just change, it swung wildly between extremes that would devastate modern civilization. 1 millennium you're living in grasslands teeming with game. 10,000 years later, those same grasslands are buried under ice sheets 2 miles thick. Then, just when your descendants have adapted to the frozen wasteland, the ice retreats and floods reshape entire continents. This happened over and over again, at least 17 major glacial cycles during the Pleistocene, each one transforming the world so completely that survival strategies that worked for your great-grandparents might be completely useless by the time you had children of your own. During glacial maximums, ice covered 1/3 of Earth's land surface. Sea levels dropped by 400 feet as water got locked up in continental ice sheets. Entire regions that are now underwater, the Bering Land Bridge, the Sunda Shelf connecting Southeast Asian islands, the North Sea, these became dry land, creating migration routes and new territories to exploit. But here's what made it truly brutal. It wasn't just colder. The glacial cycles sucked moisture out of the atmosphere. Deserts expanded. Rainfall became unpredictable. The reliable water sources that sustained life during interglacial periods would simply disappear, forcing populations to migrate or die. Your ancestors survived this, not once, not twice, but through 17 complete cycles of environmental catastrophe. How? They became the most adaptable predators Earth had ever produced. Let's talk about what they were hunting. Because the Pleistocene wasn't just an ice age. It was the age of giants. Woolly mammoths stood 14 feet tall at the shoulder, weighed 10 tons, and were covered in fur. That could be 3 feet long. Their tusks curved 16 feet in massive spirals, capable of smashing through ice to reach frozen vegetation, or defending against the only predator stupid enough to hunt them: humans. Picture the first time your ancestors decided to take one down. You're 5.5 feet tall, weigh maybe 130 pounds soaking wet, and your best weapon is a sharpened stick with a stone point. You're proposing to kill something that weighs 150 times more than you, has natural armor in the form of thick hide and fur, and can trample you into paste with casual indifference. This isn't hunting. This is organized suicide with a meal at the end if you're incredibly lucky, but they figured it out. Archaeological sites across Europe and Asia preserve the evidence. Mammoth kill sites showing systematic butchery, bone beds where entire herds were driven over cliffs or into bogs where they couldn't escape, tool marks on ribs and vertebrae revealing exactly where hunters cut to access the richest meat and fat. The strategy required everything that made humans special: planning weeks in advance, scouting territories, identifying migration routes, coordinating groups of hunters using complex communication, understanding animal behavior well enough to predict where a herd would be next month, developing weapons sophisticated enough to penetrate thick hide, managing the incredible courage required to close with an animal that could kill you with one swipe. And then, after the kill, the real work began. A mammoth provides 4 to 5 tons of meat. That's enough protein to feed a band of 30 people for months. But you have to process it immediately, butcher the carcass before it spoils, preserve the meat through smoking or freezing, render the fat for fuel and waterproofing, save the bones for tools and shelter, process the hide for clothing. Mammoth hunting wasn't just about bravery, it was industrial-scale resource processing. A successful kill could sustain a community through an entire winter. But it required dozens of people working in perfect coordination, drawing on generations of accumulated knowledge about anatomy, preservation techniques and resource management. And mammoths were just the beginning. Woolly rhinoceros, massive armoured beasts with horns that could gore a human in half. Cave bears that stood 12 feet tall and weighed a ton, competing with humans for the best shelter sites. Giant elk, with antlers spanning 12 feet. Massive bison species twice the size of modern buffalo. In the Americas, there were even more bizarre megafauna. Giant ground sloths the size of elephants. Glyptodonts, basically Volkswagen-sized armadillos. Saber-toothed cats that could open their jaws 120 degrees to drive their massive fangs through thick hide. Short-faced bears that ran like wolves and stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder. Your ancestors hunted all of them, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The archaeological record preserves both triumphs and disasters. Mammoth kill sites showing sophisticated butchery, human skeletons with injuries from cave bear attacks, tool caches hidden in rock shelters, waiting for hunters who never returned. But here's what's remarkable. They didn't just hunt. They observed. They learned. They adapted their strategies to each species. Over thousands of generations, humans accumulated an encyclopedia of knowledge about animal behavior, anatomy, seasonal patterns, and optimal hunting techniques. This knowledge was survival. The difference between feeding your children and watching them starve. And it had to be passed down perfectly from generation to generation because there were no second chances. Forget the migration route of the reindeer herds and your entire band might die. Misidentify which mushrooms were safe to eat and you'd be dead before sunset, which brings us to shelter, because killing a mammoth is one thing, surviving the night is another. In regions with natural caves, the choice was obvious. Caves provided protection from weather, predators, and the worst of the winter cold. But they came with problems. Cave bears used the same spaces, and they didn't like sharing. The archaeological record shows repeated conflict between humans and bears for control of the best shelter sites. Sometimes the humans won, sometimes the bears did. Either way, living in caves meant constant vigilance against very large, very angry neighbours. Where caves weren't available, your ancestors got creative. In Ukraine and Russia, archaeologists have found the remains of structures built entirely from mammoth bones. Imagine the engineering. You use massive skulls as foundation pieces, interlock tusks to create a framework, stack ribs and long bones to build walls, cover everything with hides weighted down with more bones, seal gaps with moss and mud. The result is a dwelling that could house 12 people, maintain a central fire, and withstand blizzards that would kill anyone caught outside. These weren't crude huts. They were sophisticated structures requiring weeks of labour and deep understanding of engineering principles. The oldest of these mammoth bone dwellings dates to 25,000 years ago. But the design principles using the bones of your prey as building materials probably goes back much further. It's the ultimate recycling. The animal that feeds you also shelters you through the winter that would otherwise kill you. In more temperate regions, humans built different structures. Lean-tos of branches and hides, pit houses dug partially underground for insulation, seasonal hunting camps designed to be abandoned and rebuilt as groups followed animal migrations. The archaeological evidence shows something profound. By at least 400,000 years ago, humans weren't just finding shelter, they were creating home bases, places they returned to year after year, sites where multiple generations left their mark. This represents a fundamental shift in human behavior, from nomads who wandered constantly to people who had territories, seasonal rounds, places that mattered. But shelter alone wasn't enough. You also needed clothing. Because humans are tropical apes, we evolved in Africa without fur, relying on sweating to cool off. That's fine on the savannah. It's fatal in Ice Age Europe, where winter temperatures could drop to -40 and stay there for months. Your ancestors solved this problem through technology. They became the only primates to develop complex clothing, and the evidence of their solution is written in our DNA. Body lice, the kind that live in clothing rather than hair, diverged from head lice around 170,000 years ago. That's when genetic analysis suggests humans began wearing clothes regularly enough that lice adapted to the new environment. But simple clothing isn't enough for Ice Age survival. You need sophisticated, tailored garments that seal out wind, trap heat, and allow enough movement to hunt and gather. The technology required is remarkable. First, you need to process hides. Scrape off all the fat and tissue. Soak them in tannins or smoke them to prevent rotting. Stretch and work them until they're pliable. This takes days of labour for a single hide. Then you need to cut patterns, not just wrapping yourself in skins, but creating pieces that fit together to cover your entire body. Boots, leggings, tunics, gloves, hoods, each piece carefully sized to trap warm air against your skin while allowing movement. And to sew it all together you need needles. Not just any needles, but fine bone or ivory needles with eyes small enough to thread sinew through. The earliest known needles date to 50,000 years ago, but the principles of sewing probably go back much further. This represents hundreds of hours of skilled labour, processing hides, cutting patterns, sewing seams, creating garments sophisticated enough to protect you from weather that would kill you in hours without proper clothing. And you have to do this while also hunting, gathering, maintaining shelter, making tools, caring for children, and performing all the other tasks required for survival. The labour investment in just staying alive was enormous. Which brings us to the rhythm of daily life. Because survival wasn't just about occasional mammoth hunts and building shelters. It was about the constant grinding work of staying fed in an environment that was trying to kill you. Your ancestors weren't just hunters. That's a myth perpetuated by archaeological evidence that preserves bones, but not plant remains. In reality, most calories probably came from gathering. Plants, nuts, berries, roots, mushrooms, bird eggs, shellfish, insects, whatever was edible and available. The work was divided, though not as strictly as anthropologists once thought. Women did most of the gathering, but also hunted small game. Men did most of the large game hunting, but also gathered plant foods. Children contributed what they could, learning skills that would keep them alive as adults. Elderly people who could no longer hunt or gather long distances provided childcare and passed down the accumulated knowledge that meant survival. The pattern was seasonal. Spring meant following migrating herds to their calving grounds, easy prey in the form of young animals. Summer brought abundant plant foods, time to process and store what you could. Fall required intensive gathering and hunting to build up food stores for winter. Winter was survival mode, living off stored resources and whatever you could find or hunt in the frozen landscape. This required sophisticated planning. You had to know not just where resources were now, but where they would be 3 months from now. Which valleys held snow longer, which groves would have nuts first, where fish spawned. When the herds moved through, humans became walking encyclopedias of landscape knowledge. A skilled hunter could read tracks, scat and browse patterns to predict animal movements days in advance. An experienced gatherer could identify hundreds of plant species by sight, knowing which were edible, which were medicinal, which would kill you if you weren't careful. This knowledge was literally life and death, and it had to be taught, passed down through generations with perfect accuracy. This is probably when storytelling became central to human culture. Not just entertainment, but education. Stories about the winter the old shelters collapsed. Tales of the poisonous berries that looked like the edible ones. Legends of successful hunts and failed ones, each carrying lessons that might save lives decades later. But even with all this knowledge and skill, life was precarious beyond modern comprehension. Infant mortality was probably 40 to 50%. Half of all children died before age 5 from disease, accidents, starvation, or predation. Those who survived to adolescence faced constant dangers: hunting accidents, infections from simple cuts, childbirth complications, exposure, violence. The average lifespan was maybe 30 years. Not because humans were physically incapable of living longer. Skeletons show some individuals survived well into their 50s and 60s, but because most people died young from causes that would be trivial today. A broken bone that got infected, a difficult childbirth, a bad winter when food stores ran out. Yet the archaeological record also shows something beautiful: evidence of care. A Neanderthal skeleton from Iraq shows a man who survived for years after an injury that should have killed him. He lost the use of one arm, was partially blind, and needed constant assistance. But his group kept him alive, fed him, protected him, valued him enough to invest resources in his survival, even though he couldn't contribute much to hunting or gathering. Other skeletons show healed, fractures, evidence of nursing through injuries, dental abscesses that were somehow treated, elderly individuals who survived long past their productive years. Your ancestors weren't just surviving, they were caring for each other, developing the social bonds and ethical frameworks that would eventually become the foundation of civilization. They were also beginning to understand medicine, not in any scientific sense, but through observation and experimentation passed down through generations. Which plants reduced fever, which bark could be chewed for pain, how to set broken bones and immobilize them while they healed, how to lance infections and pack wounds with materials that reduced inflammation. We know they had this knowledge because they survived injuries that would kill you without treatment, and because traces of medicinal plants show up in Neanderthal tooth calculus, preserved for 50,000 years, evidence that they were deliberately using plants that had no nutritional value but were known pain relievers and antibiotics. This was the Stone Age, not a primitive existence of brutish savages barely clinging to life, but a sophisticated adaptation to the harshest environments Earth had to offer. Your ancestors faced ice ages, megafauna, climate catastrophes, and daily threats that would kill most modern humans in days. And they not only survived, they thrived. They spread across continents. They developed technologies. They built communities. They cared for their sick and elderly. They created art and ritual and meaning in a world that offered mostly hardship and death. They did this for millions of years, hundreds of thousands of generations, each one passing down the knowledge, skills, and sheer stubbornness required to see another sunrise in a world that was constantly trying to end their existence. And then they started doing something even more remarkable. They started creating meaning, developing art, engaging in ritual, thinking symbolically about their place in a cosmos they barely understood but desperately wanted to explain. That's where the story goes next. To the birth of the modern mind. Something happened to the human mind between 100,000 and 40,000 years ago. Something profound, something that separates us from every other species that has ever lived. And here's the truly unsettling part. We still don't fully understand what it was or why it happened when it did. Your ancestors had been making tools for over 3 million years. They'd mastered fire. They'd survived climate catastrophes that would have destroyed lesser species. They had language, complex social structures, the ability to plan and cooperate. But they didn't make art. Not until something changed in the human brain, some threshold was crossed, some switch was flipped. And when it finally happened, it exploded across the world like nothing evolution had ever produced before. The first whispers of this transformation show up in Africa around 100,000 years ago. But the real signature, the undeniable proof that humans had become something new, appears in a cave on the southern coast of Africa called Blombos Cave. 77,000 years ago, someone sat in that cave with a piece of red ochre about the size of a crayon. They didn't use it for anything practical. They didn't grind it up to make paint for camouflage or ritual. They took a sharp stone and carefully engraved a geometric pattern onto its surface, cross-hatched lines forming a repeating design, abstract, intentional, meaningless except as a symbol. Think about what that requires. You have to conceive of something that doesn't exist in nature. You have to hold that mental image stable while your hands create it. You have to believe that making this pattern matters, that it means something, even if only to you. This is symbolic thinking, the ability to let one thing represent another thing, the foundation of all art, all mathematics, all written language, all religion, everything that makes human consciousness unique. And someone was doing it 77,000 years ago in South Africa. But that was just the beginning. The archaeological record shows these early experiments with symbolism spreading slowly at first. Shell beads drilled with tiny holes for stringing appear at multiple sites across Africa between 75,000 and 100,000 years ago. Not just random shells, specific species selected for their colour and shape, brought from the coast to inland sites dozens of miles away, carefully perforated using tools that left characteristic wear patterns. These weren't utility items. You can't eat a shell necklace. It won't keep you warm or help you hunt. But it does something else, something equally important for humans. It marks you as part of a group. It signals your status. It makes a statement about who you are and where you belong. For the first time in evolutionary history, individual identity was becoming something that could be crafted, displayed, negotiated through material culture. Then around 50,000 years ago, everything accelerates. It's like humans discovered the instruction manual for their own consciousness. The archaeological record goes from scattered hints of symbolic behaviour to an absolute explosion of creativity. This is what researchers call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, though revolution might be too mild a word. It was more like a cognitive supernova. In Europe, modern humans who had recently arrived from Africa started doing something unprecedented. They went deep into caves, far beyond the entrance zones where anyone would actually live, into chambers that required crawling through tight passages and navigating complete darkness. And there, by the flickering light of animal fat lamps, they created the first great art galleries in human history. Chauvet Cave in southern France contains paintings that are 36,000 years old, not crude stick figures or simple handprints. Sophisticated, naturalistic depictions of animals rendered with shading, perspective, and an understanding of motion that wouldn't be surpassed until the Renaissance. Cave lions stalking across limestone walls, herds of horses flowing around natural rock formations, woolly rhinoceros captured mid-charge with such accuracy you can identify the species from the paintings alone. The artist who created these works understood anatomy. They understood how light creates volume. They knew how to use the natural contours of the cave wall to give their subjects three-dimensional form. A bulge in the rock becomes a bison's shoulder. A crack becomes the fold of an ear. They weren't just drawing what they saw. They were transforming the cave itself into something alive. Lascaux, painted around 17,000 years ago, takes this even further. The famous Hall of Bulls features animals so large they dominate the space, creating an immersive environment that must have been overwhelming by firelight. 4 massive aurochs, Extinct wild cattle with 6-foot horn spans thunder across the ceiling. Around them, horses, deer, and mysterious geometric symbols whose meaning remains completely unknown. And Altamira in Spain, with its ceiling of bison painted 14,000 years ago, shows artists at the absolute peak of their abilities. The bison are depicted in various poses, standing, lying down, running, looking back over their shoulders. The red ochre gives them warmth. The black charcoal provides depth and definition. They're beautiful, powerful, alive in a way that transcends mere representation. But here's the question that keeps archaeologists awake at night. Why? Why did humans spend enormous effort creating art in places where they didn't live? Places that were difficult and dangerous to access? What were they trying to do? The obvious answer is hunting magic. Paint the animal, control the animal, create its image, and you create power over it. Some of the paintings show spears or wounds, supporting this interpretation. If your survival depends on successfully hunting massive, dangerous animals with Stone Age technology, maybe creating their image helps you prepare, gives you confidence, increases your chances through some supernatural mechanism your culture believes in. But that doesn't explain everything. Many of the animals painted weren't commonly hunted. Cave lions and rhinoceros were apex predators that humans avoided, not prey they pursued. And some caves show layers of painting spanning thousands of years, suggesting they were pilgrimage sites, places of ongoing ritual importance. These weren't just hunting preparation. They were something deeper. Some researchers think the deep caves were places for shamanic journeys. The sensory deprivation, the flickering lights, the difficulty of access all create altered states of consciousness. Add in possible use of psychoactive plants, rhythmic drumming, and days of fasting, and you have the perfect environment for mystical experiences. The paintings might be records of visions, attempts to capture encounters with the spirit world. Others suggest they were teaching tools. Young hunters taken deep into the earth to learn about the animals they'd need to know. The naturalistic detail, the focus on anatomy and behavior supports this. These could be the world's first textbooks, sacred knowledge preserved in stone, or maybe they were stories. Narratives about ancestors, about great hunts, about the relationship between humans and animals. Some cave painting sequences show what might be movement, sequential images that could represent events unfolding over time. The first movies projected onto stone screens by firelight. The truth is, we don't know, and that uncertainty is humbling. These artists were anatomically identical to us, had brains just like ours, were capable of everything we're capable of, but their motivations, their beliefs, the meaning they found in their art, all of that is lost. We can see what they made, we just can't fully understand why. What we do know is that the impulse to create wasn't limited to painting. All across Europe, Asia, and Africa, humans were developing new forms of symbolic expression. Personal ornamentation exploded in diversity and complexity. Shell beads were joined by carved bone pendants, ivory bracelets, fox-tooth necklaces. Some bodies were buried wearing elaborate regalia, hundreds or thousands of beads carefully sewn onto clothing that has long since rotted away. This tells us something crucial about the human mind. We weren't just aware of ourselves as individuals anymore. We were aware of how others perceived us. We cared about status, about beauty, about leaving a lasting impression. Identity had become something that could be constructed, performed, displayed through material culture. And we were thinking about death, not just as something that happened, but as something meaningful, something that required ritual and ceremony. Neanderthals were doing this too. Around 70,000 years ago in Shanidar Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal man was buried in a depression carved into the cave floor. Soil analysis found unusually high concentrations of flower pollen around the body, arranged in a way that suggests someone had placed flowering plants on or around the grave. Yarrow, cornflowers, hollyhocks. Some of these plants had medicinal properties. All of them bloomed in spring and summer. Someone had gathered them and placed them with the dead. Whether this was religious belief, respect for the deceased, or simple affection for a lost family member, we can't say. But it shows that Neanderthals, like modern humans, had crossed the threshold into symbolic thinking. They understood death as something more than just the cessation of life. They believed it mattered enough to mark it with ceremony. Modern human burials from the same period show even more elaborate practices. The Red Lady of Paviland, buried 33,000 years ago in Wales, was actually a young man covered head to toe in red ochre and buried with ivory rods, bracelets, and perforated seashells. The ochre alone would have taken hours to apply, and the grave goods represented significant wealth. This wasn't just disposal of a body. This was a statement about who this person had been, what they had meant to their community. And then there's music. Around 40,000 years ago, in what is now Germany, someone carved a flute from the wing bone of a griffon vulture. It has 5 finger holes carefully positioned to create a specific scale. When researchers made a replica and tested it, the flute produced clear, resonant notes. Melodies that humans hadn't heard in 40,000 years suddenly filled the air again. Imagine being the person who made that flute. You had to understand that hollow bones could produce sound. You had to figure out where to place the holes to create the notes you wanted. You had to have a concept of music as something worth creating, worth the hours of careful work needed to craft an instrument. And then you played it. Maybe alone, maybe for others. Melodies carried on Ice Age winds, the first deliberate music in human history. Other flutes have been found, made from mammoth ivory and bird bones. Some have more holes, suggesting more complex scales. By 30,000 years ago, humans across Europe were making music. Probably singing too, though voices leave no fossils. The capacity for music might be much older. Evolution of our vocal apparatus and auditory processing suggests we've been capable of complex sound production for hundreds of thousands of years. But instruments, deliberate creation of music through crafted tools, that's new. That's part of the modern mind. All of this raises a question that philosophers and neuroscientists still argue about. When did humans become truly conscious? When did we develop what psychologists call theory of mind, the understanding that other people have internal mental states just like we do? When did we start thinking about thinking, become aware of our own awareness? The archaeological record suggests it wasn't a single moment, but a gradual emergence. The abstract engravings at Blombus show someone was thinking symbolically 77,000 years ago. The cave paintings demonstrate theory of mind. The artists were creating images they knew would affect viewers, were trying to communicate something to people who might see their work thousands of years later. The burial practices prove awareness of death as a meaningful transition, not just an ending. The music shows aesthetic sense, the ability to create and appreciate beauty for its own sake. Somewhere in this timeline, humans became the only species that knows it's going to die. We developed the ability to imagine our own future non-existence. This is simultaneously the most terrifying and most liberating aspect of human consciousness. It drives our fear and our creativity in equal measure. It makes us build monuments, create art, tell stories, anything to leave something of ourselves behind when we're gone. Maybe that's what all the art is really about, not hunting magic or shamanic visions or teaching tools, though it might have served all those purposes. Maybe it's about the simple, overwhelming need to say, I was here, I existed, I mattered. To leave a mark on stone that would outlast flesh, to create beauty that would persist when everything else had turned to dust. If so, those ancient artists succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. 40,000 years later, we still crawl into those caves. We still stare at their bison and horses and handprints. We still wonder who they were and what they were thinking. They achieved a kind of immortality most of us will never know. The modern mind had been born. Humans were no longer just surviving. They were creating meaning, asking questions, trying to understand their place in a vast and mysterious universe. They were becoming us, and the world would never be the same. Something changed around 50,000 years ago. Not suddenly, not everywhere at once, but like a wave building momentum across the planet. Modern humans, your direct ancestors, had been relatively quiet for tens of thousands of years. Sure, they'd survived, they'd adapted, they'd spread out of Africa in small groups, establishing footholds in the Middle East and parts of Asia. But they hadn't exactly set the world on fire. Then the explosion happened. Within just 40,000 years, roughly the span from now back to the earliest cave paintings, modern humans went from being one human species among several to being the only human species left standing. They colonized every continent except Antarctica. They crossed oceans that should have been uncrossable with Stone Age technology. They hunted animals to extinction on multiple continents. They created art that still moves us today, 30,000 years later. And they did all of this while the world was locked in an ice age that made much of the planet nearly uninhabitable. This wasn't gradual evolution anymore. This was revolution. The Upper Paleolithic Revolution. And it's the moment when everything that makes us human, everything we think of as distinctly human behavior, exploded into full expression. Let's start with the technology, because that's where the archaeological evidence is clearest. Before 50,000 years ago, human toolkits had been slowly improving for millions of years. Hand axes got more refined, spear points got sharper, scrapers became more specialized. But the changes were incremental, taking thousands of years to become noticeable. Then suddenly, everything accelerates. By 40,000 years ago, modern humans were making blade tools, long, thin pieces of stone struck from prepared cores that could be 20 times longer than they were wide. These weren't just sharper than earlier tools, they were fundamentally different in concept. A single stone core could produce dozens of identical blades, each one a standardized component that could be hafted onto spears, arrows, or knives. This is mass production. This is thinking about tools as interchangeable parts, a cognitive leap that wouldn't become widespread again until the Industrial Revolution. But blades were just the beginning. By 30,000 years ago, Upper Paleolithic toolkits included specialized implements that earlier humans had never imagined. Bone needles with actual eyes for thread, enabling tailored clothing that could keep people warm in Arctic conditions. Harpoons with backward-facing barbs for catching fish and marine mammals. Spear throwers, called atlatls, that used leverage to triple the power and range of spears. This last invention is particularly brilliant. An atlatl is basically a stick with a handle at one end and a hook at the other. You rest your spear on it, hook the back end, and use the atlatl to extend your throwing arm by 2 feet. Simple physics. But it meant a human could now kill a caribou or mammoth from 60 yards away instead of 20. That's the difference between risky and relatively safe hunting. That's the difference between occasional success and reliable food supply. And they were innovating constantly. Not over thousands of years, but over generations. Archaeological sites from this period show tool designs changing and improving within decades, not millennia. This is cultural evolution operating at unprecedented speed. Knowledge being shared, refined, and passed on faster than ever before in human history. But here's what makes this technological explosion really interesting. It wasn't happening in isolation. Modern humans weren't the only ones innovating during this period. Neanderthals in Europe were also developing new technologies, creating more sophisticated tools, even making symbolic art. For a while, it looked like both species were on parallel tracks, both becoming more culturally complex at the same time. Then around 40,000 years ago, modern humans arrived in Europe in significant numbers, and within 10,000 years the Neanderthals were gone. What happened? Did we kill them? Outcompete them? Absorb them through interbreeding? The honest answer is we don't know for certain, and the truth is probably more complicated than any single explanation. The genetic evidence tells us there was definitely interbreeding. Every person of non-African descent carries 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, so clearly there was some mixing, some level of cooperation or at least tolerance. But the archaeological record tells a grimmer story. As modern humans spread across Europe, Neanderthal sites become fewer and farther between. Neanderthal populations contract into refuges in Spain and Gibraltar, places that were warmer and more hospitable during the Ice Age, and then, around 39,000 years ago, they disappear entirely from the fossil record. Did we hunt them to extinction? Probably not directly. There's no evidence of systematic warfare, no mass graves of Neanderthals killed by modern humans. But we might not have needed to fight them. We just needed to be slightly better at surviving. Think about it this way. You have two populations competing for the same resources in the same territories. Both are intelligent, both are capable hunters, both have sophisticated tools and social structures. But one group, the modern humans, has a slight edge. Maybe their tools are 10% more efficient. Maybe their social networks are a bit larger, allowing them to pool resources more effectively. Maybe their language is slightly more precise, enabling better coordination during hunts. These tiny advantages compound over generations. The group with the edge has slightly more children survive to adulthood. They expand into slightly more territories. They can weather bad years slightly better. Over a few thousand years, the population with the advantage expands while the other contracts. It's not dramatic. It's not violent. It's just mathematics. And the Neanderthals, already living in small populations scattered across Ice Age Europe, were vulnerable to this kind of gradual displacement. Group by group, they lost access to the best hunting territories. Their populations became isolated, more inbred, less able to adapt to changing conditions. Some groups probably died out from disease, others from local climate disasters. A few might have been absorbed through interbreeding with modern humans. By 39,000 years ago, they were gone. A species that had thrived in Europe for over 200,000 years, that had survived multiple ice ages, that had developed culture and art and symbolic thinking, was extinct. And the only humans left in Europe were us. The same thing was happening elsewhere. The Denisovans, who had dominated Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, disappear from the fossil record around the same time. Other human species we're just discovering through genetics and fragmentary fossils. All of them vanished during this narrow window between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago. Within 20,000 years, a blink in evolutionary time, the human family tree went from multiple branches to a single twig. Homo sapiens, us, alone. But while this extinction event was playing out in Europe and Asia, something even more remarkable was happening elsewhere. Modern humans were pushing into territories that no human species had ever reached, and they were doing it using technologies that seem impossible given the resources they had available. 65,000 years ago, modern humans reached Australia. Let that sink in for a moment. Australia is an island continent separated from Asia by at least 50 miles of open ocean at the narrowest point. There has never been a land bridge during human existence. You cannot walk, swim or drift to Australia by accident. To reach it, you need boats, multiple boats, because you need enough people to establish a viable breeding population. And you need navigation skills, because sailing out of sight of land in a dugout canoe requires planning and courage that's hard for us to even imagine today. Yet somehow, with Stone Age technology, modern humans made that crossing. Multiple crossings, actually, because they colonized Australia thoroughly. Within a few thousand years, humans had spread to every corner of the continent, from the tropical north to the temperate south, from coastal regions to the arid interior. This wasn't accident. This wasn't luck. This was systematic exploration and colonization of a new world, and it fundamentally changes what we thought Stone Age humans were capable of. They weren't just following herds or wandering into new territories. They were intentionally crossing ocean barriers to reach lands they could only have guessed existed. The archaeology from early Australia shows these first colonisers brought sophisticated technology with them. Groundstone axes, one of the earliest examples of grinding and polishing stone tools, complex hafting techniques using plant resins. Most remarkably, they brought art. Some of the oldest rock art in the world is found in Australian caves, created within a few thousand years of human arrival. These weren't desperate survivors scraping by in a hostile environment. These were confident, capable people ready to make this new land their home, and they transformed it. Australia 65,000 years ago was home to megafauna that would seem impossible today. Marsupial lions the size of leopards, wombats the size of small cars, kangaroos over 10 feet tall, giant flightless birds that made ostriches look tiny. All of them evolved in isolation from humans, which meant they had no instinctive fear of these weird bipedal apes walking around with spears. Within 20,000 years of human arrival, most of them were extinct. Now, we can't prove humans alone killed off Australian megafauna. Climate change was also happening, the Ice Age cycling through warming and cooling periods that transformed habitats. But it's a hell of a coincidence that these animals survived millions of years of climate fluctuation, then went extinct within 20,000 years of humans showing up. And Australia wasn't unique. The pattern repeats itself across the globe. Humans reached the Americas between 15,000 and 25,000 years ago. The exact timing is still hotly debated. But whether they came across the Bering Land Bridge during an ice age when sea levels dropped, or followed coastal routes in boats, or both, the result was the same. Within 2,000 years of human arrival, North and South America had been colonized from Alaska to Patagonia. And within another few thousand years, the American megafauna was gone. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, giant beavers the size of bears, all extinct. Some of these extinctions were clearly human-caused. We have mammoth skeletons with spear points embedded in the bones. We have sites where hundreds of animals were driven off cliffs in mass kill events. Early Americans weren't subtle hunters. They had discovered that big animals with no fear of humans were easy prey, and they exploited that advantage ruthlessly. But were humans solely responsible? The timing is suspicious, but not conclusive. The end of the Ice Age was also bringing massive climate disruption. Habitats were changing rapidly as glaciers retreated and sea levels rose. Many of these megafauna species were already under stress from environmental changes. Human hunting might have just been the final push over the edge for species already struggling to adapt. What we can say with certainty is this: wherever humans arrived during the Upper Paleolithic, large animal extinctions followed within a few thousand years. Madagascar, New Zealand, islands across the Pacific, the pattern holds everywhere. And while climate change surely played a role, it's hard to escape the conclusion that our ancestors, armed with increasingly sophisticated hunting technology and absolutely no conservation ethics, were very good at killing things into extinction. But they weren't just destroying, they were also creating. The Upper Paleolithic left us some of the most extraordinary art in human history. Not primitive scratchings or crude stick figures, but sophisticated, beautiful, emotionally resonant works that still move us 30,000 years later. The cave paintings at Chauvet in France, created 36,000 years ago, show horses and lions rendered with anatomical precision and artistic sophistication that wouldn't be surpassed until the Renaissance. The artists understood perspective, used shading to create three-dimensional effects, even seemed to understand animation, painting multiple legs on animals to suggest movement. Venus figurines appear across Europe between 35,000 and 25,000 years ago. Small sculptures of women, often with exaggerated sexual characteristics, carved from stone, bone, or ivory. We don't know what they meant to the people who made them. Religious icons, fertility symbols, prehistoric pornography. But their widespread distribution suggests they held some kind of important cultural meaning that was shared across thousands of miles. burials became increasingly elaborate during this period. Bodies arranged in careful positions, covered in ochre, accompanied by grave goods, beads, tools, animal remains, sometimes elaborate headdresses made from shells or carved ivory. These weren't just disposing of bodies. These were rituals, ceremonies that suggest belief in an afterlife, or at least the importance of honouring the dead. And everywhere, there are signs of symbolic thinking. Beads made from shells traded hundreds of miles from the ocean, pendants carved with abstract patterns, notched bones that might be counting systems or lunar calendars, flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory. These people were creating art for art's sake, making things beautiful for no practical reason except that beauty mattered to them. They were, in other words, fully modern humans in every meaningful sense, not just anatomically modern, but behaviourally modern. They had the same drives, the same creativity, the same capacity for abstract thought that we have today. If you could somehow kidnap an Upper Paleolithic baby and raise them in the modern world, they would be indistinguishable from any other human. They could learn calculus, play piano, write poetry, code software. The hardware was identical, only the cultural software was different. By 12,000 years ago, modern humans had reached the peak of Ice Age culture. Sophisticated tool technology refined over thousands of years. Complex social networks spanning thousands of miles. Art and ritual and symbolic thinking fully developed. They had colonized every continent except Antarctica, adapting to every environment Earth had to offer, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest to scorching deserts. They were hunter-gatherers, living in mobile bands that followed animal migrations and seasonal plant resources. But they weren't living hand-to-mouth anymore. They were storing food for lean seasons, building semi-permanent structures in places with reliable resources, establishing territorial boundaries and trade networks, creating the social complexity that would eventually enable agriculture and civilization. And they had no idea their world was about to transform completely. The Ice Age was ending. Within a few thousand years, the climate would warm dramatically. The glaciers would retreat, sea levels would rise, and the megafauna that had dominated the landscape for millions of years would largely disappear, hunted to extinction or unable to adapt to rapidly changing habitats. The stage was being set for the final act of the Stone Age, the Neolithic Revolution, the moment when humans stopped following their food and started growing it, when temporary camps became permanent villages, when villages became towns, when towns became cities. But that transformation was still ahead. For now, 12,000 years ago, humans stood at a threshold they couldn't see. The most successful hunters in the planet's history, masters of stone technology, conquerors of continents. They had survived everything the Ice Age could throw at them. They had outlasted every other human species. They had spread across the entire world using nothing but stone, bone, and wood. They were about to discover they could remake the world itself. But the stone tools that had served humanity for 3.3 million years were about to become obsolete. Not because of metal, not yet, but because of something far more revolutionary. Seeds. The ice was dying. For over 100,000 years, glaciers had covered half the northern hemisphere. Ice sheets miles thick had buried Scandinavia, crushed the landscape of Canada, turned Britain into a frozen wasteland connected to continental Europe by vast plains of tundra and grassland. Your ancestors had adapted to this world. They knew how to track reindeer across endless snowfields, how to survive in the biting cold, how to read the behaviour of mammoths and woolly rhinos. They were Ice Age specialists, perfectly adapted to a world of cold and megafauna. Then, around 12,000 years ago, the world betrayed them. It started subtly. Summers that lasted a few weeks longer, winters that were slightly less brutal, snow that melted a little faster each spring. But within just a few centuries, the changes became catastrophic. The massive ice sheets that had defined the northern world for millennia began collapsing. Not slowly, not gradually, but in rapid, terrifying pulses. Entire glaciers, some the size of modern countries, melted in just decades. The water had to go somewhere. Sea levels rose, not by inches but by hundreds of feet. Coastlines that had been stable for tens of thousands of years vanished underwater within a human lifetime. Valleys became bays, plains became seas, islands disappeared, and with them went territories that had supported human populations for generations. Imagine watching the world you knew disappear. The hunting grounds your grandparents had shown you, the seasonal camps your family had used for hundreds of years, the landmarks that had guided your people since time immemorial, all swallowed by rising waters. The herds you depended on migrating to territories you couldn't reach. The entire ecosystem you understood transforming into something alien and unfamiliar. This was the Mesolithic transition. The name means Middle Stone Age, which makes it sound like a brief stepping stone between more important periods. But that's misleading. This was one of the most dramatic transformation events in human history, a crisis that forced our ancestors to reinvent their entire way of life or go extinct trying. The most spectacular casualty was a place we now call Doggerland. Picture a landscape larger than modern England, stretching from Britain to Denmark, from the Netherlands to Norway. Not ocean, as it is today, but land. Rich, productive land covered in forests, marshes and rivers. Archaeological evidence suggests it was one of the most densely populated regions in Europe, a paradise for Mesolithic hunters. The waters were full of fish. The marshes attracted enormous flocks of migratory birds. The forest teemed with deer, wild boar and aurochs, the massive wild cattle that would eventually become domesticated. Doggerland was probably home to thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands. They built seasonal camps, developed extensive trade networks, created sophisticated tools perfectly adapted to their environment. They weren't primitive. They were specialists, as skilled at exploiting their landscape as any modern society. Then it drowned. The process took several thousand years, but there were probably catastrophic pulses when massive sections of coastline disappeared in single generations. Imagine being a child in Doggerland, learning to fish in rivers that would be underwater before you became an elder. Imagine watching your parents' burial grounds vanish beneath the waves, cutting you off from your ancestors both physically and spiritually. Some populations managed to retreat to higher ground, eventually ending up in what's now Britain or Denmark. Others probably drowned when unexpected storm surges overwhelmed their camps. The archaeological record shows increasing evidence of violence during this period, suggesting that as productive land became scarce, human groups came into conflict over what remained. But Doggerland was just the most dramatic example. Similar transformations were happening everywhere. In North America, vast glacial lakes formed and catastrophically drained, creating enormous floods that carved new river channels and destroyed established hunting territories. In Southeast Asia, rising seas turned mainland regions into archipelagos, forcing populations to develop seafaring technologies or abandon territories they had occupied for millennia. And everywhere the ice retreated, the landscape changed fundamentally. The open tundra and grasslands that had dominated the Ice Age gave way to dense forests. This sounds like an improvement, but for human populations adapted to hunting large herd animals across open terrain, it was a disaster. Forest hunting requires completely different skills and technologies. In open terrain, you can track herds for days, coordinate group hunts, drive animals toward kill zones. Forests don't work that way. Dense vegetation makes long-distance tracking impossible. Trees break up sight lines. Large herd animals become smaller, more solitary forest dwellers. The mammoth and woolly rhino went extinct, replaced by deer and boar that were harder to hunt and provided less meat per kill. Your ancestors had to adapt fast. The archaeological record from this period shows an explosion of technological innovation, unlike anything seen before. The signature invention of the Mesolithic was the microlith, tiny stone blades often less than an inch long. This sounds like a step backward from the impressive spear points and hand axes of the Ice Age. But microliths represented a conceptual revolution. Instead of making large single-purpose tools, Mesolithic people created modular composite implements. They'd produce hundreds of tiny standardized stone blades, then mount them in wooden or bone handles using plant resin adhesives. One handle could hold multiple blades arranged in different patterns. Add them in a line and you've got a saw. Mount them in a row perpendicular to the handle and you've got a harpoon for fishing. Arrange them in a circular pattern and you've got a drill. This is manufacturing. Mass production of interchangeable parts that could be combined in different configurations for different purposes. If a blade broke, you didn't need to make an entirely new tool. You just replace the damaged component. It's the same principle that makes modern technology possible. The idea that complex tools can be built from standardized, replaceable parts. But the real genius was versatility. Ice Age hunters could survive with a limited toolkit because they were specialized for one type of hunting. Mesolithic people needed to exploit everything. Fish, birds, small game, plants, shellfish, whatever was available. The microlith system gave them that flexibility. The same toolkit could be reconfigured for fishing in the morning, bird hunting in the afternoon, and plant processing in the evening. They also developed the bow and arrow into a sophisticated hunting technology. Bows had existed before, but Mesolithic craftspeople refined them into precision instruments. They learned to select specific woods for their elastic properties, to strengthen bows with sinew backing, to craft arrows with carefully balanced weight distribution. A skilled Mesolithic archer could bring down a deer at 50 yards, something that would have been impossible with Ice Age spear-throwing technology. But perhaps the most important adaptation was social. The old Ice Age pattern of small, highly mobile hunting bands tracking megafauna herds across vast territories stopped making sense. The New World was more productive in some ways, with forests and coastlines offering diverse resources, but it was also more territorially constrained. You couldn't just follow the herds anymore because there were no more massive herds. So people started settling down, not permanently at first, but semi-permanently. Instead of moving camp every few days, Mesolithic groups began establishing seasonal settlements that they'd return to year after year. Archaeological sites show increasingly substantial structures, not just temporary shelters, but well-built houses designed to last multiple seasons. The most famous example is Lepenski Vir in Serbia, a series of settlements occupied between 9,500 and 6,000 years ago. The inhabitants built trapezoidal houses arranged in horseshoe patterns, with carefully laid stone floors and hearths positioned at precise locations. They carved elaborate stone sculptures of fish-human hybrids, suggesting complex religious beliefs tied to the rivers they depended on. This wasn't a temporary camp, this was a community, a place with architecture, art and ritual significance. Similar settlements appear across Europe, the Middle East and Asia. Starkar in Britain, Monteverde in Chile, Yomon sites in Japan. People were figuring out that in this new, warmer world, staying in one place could work better than constant mobility. If you knew the salmon would return to a particular river every spring, why not build a permanent camp there? If shellfish beds were productive year-round, why not settle nearby? This semi-sedentary lifestyle created new possibilities and new problems. On one hand, permanent settlements allowed more elaborate material culture. You could make pottery, which is too heavy and fragile for nomadic people. You could build fish weirs and traps that required maintenance. You could develop more complex social hierarchies because people were interacting daily, rather than just during seasonal gatherings. On the other hand, living in one place created challenges. Sanitation became an issue. Disease could spread more easily in permanent settlements. Resource depletion meant you had to manage your environment carefully or face local extinction of the fish and game you depended on. But the most revolutionary development was happening in a place called the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern Iraq and Syria to the eastern Mediterranean. Here, a culture called the Natufians was pushing semi-sedentism to its logical extreme. Around 12,000 years ago, the Natufians were building villages, not seasonal camps, but permanent settlements with stone foundations, storage facilities, and cemeteries. They were still hunter-gatherers, but they were hunter-gatherers who lived in one place year-round. How was this possible? The answer was wild cereals. The Fertile Crescent was home to wild wheat and barley that grew in dense stands. The Natufians discovered they could harvest these grains in enormous quantities, then store them in stone-lined pits for months. Suddenly, you could accumulate resources. You could harvest enough grain in a few weeks to feed your family for an entire year. This was unprecedented for hunter-gatherers, who usually lived hand-to-mouth, consuming resources as they found them. The Natufians developed specialized tools for grain processing, sickles with microlith blades for harvesting, heavy grinding stones for processing grain into flour, storage pits lined with clay to keep the grain dry. They were managing wild plant resources with an intensity that looked a lot like agriculture, even though they weren't actually planting crops yet. And they were experimenting with animals too. Genetic evidence suggests that wolves began the process of becoming dogs during this period. This wasn't a one-time domestication event, but a gradual mutualism. Wolves hung around human settlements scavenging scraps. Humans tolerated the less aggressive individuals who provided warning barks when predators approached. Over generations, this relationship deepened. The wolves became dogs, and dogs became partners in hunting, guards against predators, and companions. But the most stunning evidence of Mesolithic complexity comes from southeastern Turkey, from a place called Göbekli Tepe. When archaeologists first excavated it in the 1990s, they couldn't believe what they were finding. This was supposed to be a simple hunter-gatherer camp. Instead, they uncovered massive stone circles with carved pillars 16 feet tall, weighing up to 10 tons each. Elaborate reliefs of animals covered the pillars: foxes, lions, snakes, scorpions, birds, all carved with remarkable skill. This wasn't a settlement. There's no evidence anyone lived there. It was a ceremonial centre, a temple complex built by people who supposedly didn't have the social organisation or resources for such projects. Each stone circle required thousands of hours of labour to construct. The stones had to be quarried, moved, carved, and erected using only Stone Age technology. The conventional wisdom said this kind of monumental architecture required agriculture, permanent settlements, and complex social hierarchies. But Göbekli Tepe was built around 11,500 years ago, before agriculture existed in the region. It was built by hunter-gatherers, by people who were still living off wild resources, still using stone tools, still technically in the Stone Age. This changes everything we thought we knew. The old narrative said that agriculture created surplus resources, which allowed people to settle down, which led to social complexity and monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe suggests we had the causality backwards. Maybe the social complexity came first. Maybe hunter-gatherers were capable of far more sophisticated organisation and culture than we ever imagined. Maybe the decision to build something like Göbekli Tepe, with all the coordination and labour investment it required, actually drove the development of agriculture rather than the other way around. Think about it. If you're gathering thousands of people from across a region for seasonal ceremonies at a place like Göbekli Tepe, you need to feed them. Wild resources alone might not be sufficient. This creates pressure to intensify food production, to experiment with managing plant and animal populations more actively. Within a few thousand years of Göbekli Tepe's construction, the Natufian culture had indeed transitioned to full agriculture. But for now, during the Mesolithic, they were in between worlds. No longer fully mobile Ice Age hunters, but not yet farmers. They were experimenting, innovating, pushing the boundaries of what hunter-gatherer societies could achieve. Some groups were building permanent villages, others were constructing monumental ceremonial centres. Still others were developing increasingly intimate relationships with the plants and animals in their territories, relationships that would eventually cross the line into domestication. The archaeological record from this period shows an incredible diversity of adaptations. In northern Europe, people were becoming specialized coastal hunter-gatherers, developing sophisticated boats and fishing technologies. In the Levant, the Natufians were proto-farmers, living in villages and intensively managing wild resources. In Japan, the Jomon culture was creating some of the world's earliest pottery, while remaining hunter-gatherers for another 10,000 years. This diversity suggests something profound. There was no single path, no inevitable trajectory from hunting to farming. Different groups were experimenting with different solutions to the challenges of the warming world. Some of these experiments would eventually lead to agriculture and civilization. Others would create alternative forms of complexity that remained based on hunting and gathering. But everywhere, people were pushing boundaries, testing limits, discovering what was possible. The Mesolithic wasn't a transition in the sense of a brief period between two stable states. It was a time of explosive creativity and experimentation, when human societies were more diverse, more innovative, and more culturally complex than they'd been in millennia. And standing at the edge of this transitional period, your ancestors were about to make the decisions that would change everything. Some would embrace full sedentism and agriculture, setting in motion the chain of events that would lead to cities, states, and civilization. Others would refine their hunting and gathering lifestyles to new levels of sophistication, creating rich cultures that would persist for thousands more years. But whether they knew it or not, they were living in the last generations of the true Stone Age. Within a few thousand years, some of their descendants would discover how to grow food, domesticate animals, and eventually work metal. The 3 million year age of stone tools was entering its final chapter. But that's a story for the next section. For now, in the warming world of the Mesolithic, your ancestors were still hunters, still gatherers, still living by the skills and knowledge that had sustained humanity since the very beginning. They just happened to be the most sophisticated, innovative, and adaptable hunters the world had ever seen. Something happened around 12,000 years ago that changed everything. Not a climate disaster this time, not an extinction event, not a new predator or a volcanic eruption. This was different. This was a choice that would transform human life more profoundly than anything in the previous 3 million years. Your ancestors stopped moving. After countless generations of following herds, tracking seasonal resources, wandering from camp to camp based on where the food was, they made a decision that would have seemed absolutely insane to every human who came before them. They stayed in one place, and they made the food come to them. This is the Neolithic Revolution, the moment when humans stopped being wanderers and became farmers, when we stopped being part of nature's food chain and started controlling it, when we ended 3 million years of mobile hunting and gathering and created something that had never existed before, civilization. But here's what nobody tells you about this revolution. It didn't happen once. It didn't happen in one place. And it definitely didn't happen because someone had a brilliant idea one morning and convinced everyone else to try it. Agriculture was invented independently at least 7 different times in 7 different places by people who had no contact with each other. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East around 10,000 BCE, China's Yellow River Valley around 9,000 BCE, Mesoamerica around 7,000 BCE, the Andes and Amazonia around 6,000 BCE, Sub-Saharan Africa around 5,000 BCE, New Guinea around 7,000 BCE, and Eastern North America around 4,000 BCE. 7 separate human populations looked at wild plants and wild animals and simultaneously decided to do something that would have seemed ridiculous to their Stone Age ancestors. They decided to work harder for their food instead of less hard. Because here's the dirty secret about agriculture that nobody tells you. It's way more work than hunting and gathering. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers show they typically work about 15 to 20 hours per week to meet their food needs. That's it. The rest of the time is leisure, socializing, storytelling, making art. Early farmers, on the other hand, work sunrise to sunset, clearing fields, planting seeds, weeding, protecting crops from animals and pests, harvesting, processing, storing. Agriculture meant trading a life of relative ease for backbreaking labour. So why did they do it? The standard story you learned in school probably went something like this. Humans discovered agriculture, realised it could produce more food, and everyone happily settled down to farm. Population boomed, civilization emerged, everybody wins. But that's not what happened, not even close. The truth is far more interesting and way more complicated. The shift to agriculture wasn't a sudden discovery. It was a slow, gradual process that took thousands of years and started almost by accident. Picture this. You're living in the Middle East around 12,000 years ago. The Ice Age has finally ended for good. The climate is warming, stabilizing, becoming more predictable than it's been in hundreds of thousands of years. Your people are hunter-gatherers, but you're not constantly on the move anymore. The environment is rich enough that you can stay in one place for months at a time. Maybe you return to the same camp year after year, following seasonal patterns. Around your camps, something starts happening. Wild grasses, the ancestors of wheat and barley, start growing more thickly. Why? Because human activity creates disturbed ground, and these wild cereals love disturbed ground. Your garbage heaps become gardens without anyone planning it. The grasses growing near human camps are also subtly different from wild ones. When you harvest wild wheat, most of the seeds scatter on the ground the moment you touch the plant. That's how wild plants reproduce. But occasionally there's a mutant plant where the seeds stay attached to the stalk. In the wild, this mutation is a death sentence. The plant can't reproduce effectively. But near human camps, it's an advantage, because you're harvesting the seeds, and the ones that stay attached are the ones you actually bring back to camp, where some of them spill on disturbed ground, where they grow, where you harvest them again next year. Without anyone intending it, without anyone even noticing, you're selecting for plants that are easier to harvest. Over hundreds of generations, those wild grasses are being transformed into something new. Domesticated wheat with larger seeds that stay on the stalk. This isn't agriculture yet. You're not planting fields. You're just collecting seeds from plants that happen to grow near where you live. But slowly, incrementally, the plants are changing, and so is your behavior. You start noticing that if you scatter some seeds in cleared ground, more plants grow there the next year. You start protecting the patches where the good plants grow, pulling out competing vegetation. You start storing seeds for planting, not just eating, and one generation at a time, over thousands of years, you transition from harvesting wild plants to cultivating domesticated crops. The same thing is happening with animals. Wild sheep and goats are drawn to human camps, attracted by garbage and cleared areas where plants grow. The most aggressive, fearful animals run away. But some animals are slightly calmer, slightly more tolerant of human presence. Maybe they're genetic mutations. Maybe they're just individuals with different temperaments. Either way, they spend more time near humans. They're easier to hunt, but they're also easier to keep alive. Maybe you start penning them, keeping the females and young ones while hunting the males. Maybe you start feeding them, protecting them from predators, moving them to better grazing areas. Over generations, the animals change too. They become smaller, more docile, less fearful. Their breeding cycles shift. Their coat colours change. You're creating something that has never existed before. Domestic animals. Partners that depend on you for survival and provide you with meat, milk, leather and labour in return. But here's what's crucial to understand. This isn't progress. Not yet. Early agriculture was actually worse than hunting and gathering in almost every measurable way. Nutritional studies of early agricultural skeletons show they were less healthy than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, shorter, more prone to disease, with worse teeth, more bone lesions, more evidence of nutritional deficiencies. Why? Because agriculture meant depending on a narrow range of crops instead of a diverse wild diet. It meant eating more grains and starches, which sounds filling but actually provides less nutrition than the varied diet of meats, fruits, nuts, and vegetables that hunter-gatherers enjoyed. It meant living in permanent settlements, which sounds nice until you realize that permanent settlements mean living near your own waste, which means disease. Hunter-gatherers moved camps regularly, leaving their garbage and pathogens behind. Farmers stayed put, creating perfect conditions for parasites, bacterial infections, and epidemic diseases to spread. It meant working harder for less nutritious food while being sicker more often. So again, why did they do it? The answer appears to be that they didn't have a choice. Not really, because once you start down the path to agriculture, even slowly and accidentally, you create a trap. Agricultural populations can support more people per square mile than hunter-gatherers, not because each person is better fed, but because you can pack more poorly fed people into the same space. And once your population grows beyond what hunting and gathering can support, you can't go back. You're locked in. You have to keep farming because there are too many mouths to feed any other way. This creates a vicious cycle. Agriculture allows population growth. Population growth requires more intensive agriculture. More intensive agriculture allows more population growth. Within a few thousand years of starting to farm, early agricultural communities had populations that were absolutely dependent on their crops. A bad harvest didn't mean moving to better hunting grounds. It meant starvation. And bad harvests happened regularly, way more often than the famines that occasionally affected hunter-gatherers. Agriculture means depending on a few crops instead of hundreds of wild food sources. It means being vulnerable to droughts, floods, pests, plant diseases. It means putting all your eggs in very few baskets. But there was no going back. By 8000 BCE, communities in the Fertile Crescent had populations of hundreds, sometimes thousands. Jericho, one of the oldest known towns, had maybe 2,000 residents living in mud brick houses surrounded by a stone wall. 2,000 people who all depended on the wheat, barley, lentils and chickpeas growing in the surrounding fields, who all depended on the herds of domestic sheep and goats, who couldn't leave even if they wanted to because there was nowhere to go and no way to feed themselves without their crops and herds. This was something unprecedented in human history. Permanence. For 3 million years, humans had been mobile. We could pick up and move when resources declined, when conflicts arose, when conditions changed. Now we were stuck, and that changed everything. Permanent settlements meant you could accumulate possessions. Hunter-gatherers own only what they can carry. Farmers can own houses, furniture, pottery, stored food, livestock. For the first time in human history, wealth became a thing. Some families had more, some had less. Some had larger houses, more stored grain, bigger herds. Inequality emerged. Not the temporary status differences of hunter-gatherer societies, where a good hunter might have prestige but couldn't convert it into permanent advantage, but real generational inequality, rich families and poor families, landowners and labourers, the beginning of social classes. Permanent settlements meant you could build monuments, things too large, too heavy, too permanent to make sense for mobile people. By 7000 BCE, the residents of Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey were living in a town of maybe 10,000 people. Houses built wall to wall like a honeycomb. No streets, just roofs you walked across with ladders down into individual dwellings. Inside those houses, elaborate paintings and sculptures, bulls' heads mounted on walls, geometric patterns, hunting scenes. This wasn't just shelter. This was architecture, art. The physical embodiment of ideas meant to last generations. Permanent settlements meant specialization. When everyone's a hunter-gatherer, everyone needs to know how to find food, make tools, build shelters. But in early farming villages, some people could specialize. Potters who made the ceramic vessels that became ubiquitous in the Neolithic. Containers for storing grain, carrying water, cooking. Pottery is a revolutionary technology, but it's also heavy, fragile, pointless for mobile people. Only farmers could use it. Toolmakers who developed new technologies for agricultural life. Polished stone axes for clearing forests. Grinding stones for processing grain. Sickles with flint blades set in wooden or bone handles for harvesting. These are the signature tools of the Neolithic, more refined than earlier stone technology but fundamentally still made of rock. Stone Age tools for a radically new way of life. Religious specialists, shamans or priests who conducted rituals in shrines and temples that were starting to appear in farming villages. Organised religion is largely a Neolithic phenomenon. Hunter-gatherers had spiritual beliefs, but farmers built structures dedicated to gods and performed elaborate ceremonies tied to planting and harvest cycles, and eventually rulers, people whose job was coordinating community labour, settling disputes, organising defence, the first steps toward government, because permanent settlements meant war. When you're mobile, conflicts can be resolved by moving apart. When you're farmers, you can't leave. Your fields, your herds, your houses are fixed in place. And so are your neighbours' fields, herds and houses. Which means when there's a dispute over land or water or grazing rights, you can't walk away, you have to fight. The archaeological evidence for this is brutal and unmistakable. Neolithic sites start showing evidence of violence on a scale never seen in the Paleolithic. Fortification walls around settlements, mass graves, with signs of trauma, skeletons with embedded arrow points and crushed skulls, entire villages destroyed by fire with bodies left unburied. The early farmers weren't peaceful. They were trapped in proximity with each other, competing for limited agricultural land, fighting over resources that couldn't be shared. Warfare didn't exist among mobile hunter-gatherers, not on any large scale, but among farmers it became endemic, expected, a normal part of life. And yet, despite all of this, despite the harder work, worse health, inequality and violence, agriculture spread. By 5000 BCE, farming had replaced hunting and gathering across most of Europe, the Middle East and large parts of Asia. By 3000 BCE, the majority of humans on Earth were farmers. Why? Because agricultural societies could support larger populations, which meant more warriors, which meant they could expand at the expense of hunter-gatherers. It wasn't that farming was better for individuals, it was that farming societies were more competitive in the brutal calculus of human expansion. And agriculture kept evolving. Early farmers in the Fertile Crescent had wheat, barley, sheep, and goats. But in China, farmers were domesticating rice and millet, pigs and chickens. In Mesoamerica, maize, beans, and squash. In South America, potatoes, quinoa, and llamas. In Africa, sorghum, yams, and cattle. Each region developing its own agricultural package based on locally available plants and animals. These different agricultural traditions remained largely separate for thousands of years. The farmers of China had no idea the farmers of Mexico existed. The agriculturalists of the Middle East didn't know about the rice cultivation happening in Southeast Asia. But they were all going through similar transformations. Villages growing into towns, towns growing into cities, social structures becoming more complex, technologies becoming more sophisticated. By 5000 BCE, some agricultural societies were starting to look like something we might recognize as civilization. Large settlements with thousands of inhabitants, monumental architecture, specialized crafts and long-distance trade, complex religious institutions, emerging writing systems. The threshold was approaching. And then, around 3500 BCE, something new appeared. Metal. Copper first, just a curiosity. Then copper alloys, specifically bronze. Metal tools that could be sharper, more durable, easier to reshape than stone. The first metal implements appeared while stone tools were still dominant. For centuries, most people still used stone because metal was expensive, rare, reserved for elite goods and weapons. But bronze tools were undeniably superior for many tasks. They could hold a sharper edge. They could be melted down and recast when they broke. They could be standardized and mass-produced in ways stone tools never could be. The earliest metal didn't end the Stone Age immediately. That transition took over 1,000 years. In many places, stone tools remained dominant well into the Bronze Age. Some communities didn't adopt metal until the Iron Age began around 1200 BCE. But the threshold had been crossed. The Long Stone Age, the 3.3 million years when humans and their ancestors survived, adapted, and conquered the world using nothing but stone, wood, and bone, was ending. Those final centuries of the Neolithic saw humanity's last grand stone monuments. Stonehenge, constructed between 3000 and 2000 BCE, is perhaps the most famous. Massive sarsen stones, some weighing 25 tons, transported dozens of miles and erected in precise astronomical alignments. Nobody's entirely sure what it was for. Ceremonial centre, astronomical observatory, healing temple, burial ground. Probably all of these. What's undeniable is the sheer ambition. Thousands of people working over generations to build something that would outlast them all. A statement carved in stone that said, "We were here, we mattered, we could move mountains." Similar megalithic monuments appeared across Neolithic Europe and beyond. Stone circles, passage tombs, standing stones, all built by farming communities that still relied primarily on stone tools but had developed social organizations capable of mobilizing massive communal labor. These monuments were the Stone Age's last hurrah, proof that you didn't need metal to build something eternal. But they were also something else. They were memory. After millions of years of mobile existence, of populations that came and went leaving almost no trace, farming societies were creating permanence, structures that would stand for millennia, messages to the future, and we receive those messages. We stand at Stonehenge or Göbekli Tepe or the megalithic tombs of Ireland, and we touch the same stones they touched. We see the astronomical alignments they calculated. We trace the art they carved. We are connected directly to them across 5,000 years. That's what the Neolithic Revolution created. Connection. Not just between people in the same generation, but across time. Agriculture meant staying in place long enough to build things that mattered, to create art and architecture and knowledge worth preserving, to develop writing systems that could record history, not just live it. The Stone Age was ending, but everything it had taught us about survival, adaptation, and cooperation was about to be amplified beyond anything our ancestors could have imagined. The farmers who planted the first fields had no idea they were beginning a process that would lead to cities, states, empires, and eventually global civilization. But they had crossed the threshold. They had transformed humans from a species that adapted to the world into a species that adapted the world to itself. And there was no going back. By 3000 BCE, the first true civilizations were emerging. Sumer, Mesopotamia, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley in South Asia, each built on the agricultural foundation laid during the Neolithic, each using increasingly sophisticated metal tools alongside stone implements, each developing writing, monumental architecture, organized religion, and state-level political systems. The Stone Age was becoming the Bronze Age. The age of scattered bands was becoming the age of cities. The age of survival was becoming the age of civilization. But that's a different story. For now, just remember this. Everything that came after, every city and empire, every technological breakthrough, every work of art and literature, all of it was built on the foundation laid during those final 7,000 years of the Stone Age. The Neolithic Revolution wasn't just about learning to farm. It was about transforming what it meant to be human. From wanderers to settlers, from foragers to farmers, from living in nature to controlling it. For better and worse, for richer and poorer, in sickness and in health. We're still living with the consequences of choices made 10,000 years ago by people who just wanted to make sure there was enough food for next winter. They got their wish, and in the process they ended the longest chapter in human history and began the one we're still living today. So here we are, 3 million years later. You're lying in a climate-controlled room, surrounded by metal and plastic and silicon. Maybe you're staring at a glowing screen that would look like pure magic to your ancestors. Maybe you're drifting off to sleep, comfortable in ways that 99% of humans who ever lived could never have imagined. But here's the thing, you're not actually that different from them. Your body, still built for the Stone Age, that back pain you get from sitting at a desk all day, that's because your spine evolved to carry loads while walking upright across African savannas, not to support hunched shoulders while you type emails. Those food cravings that make you reach for sugar and fat, that's your Stone Age brain screaming at you to stock up on calories because it thinks winter is coming and you might starve. Your immune system fighting off infections, your brain solving problems, your hands crafting things. These are all Stone Age technologies. Hardware designed and refined over 3 million years of living without metal, without agriculture, without civilization. Even your emotions are Stone Age. That anxiety you feel, that's the same hypervigilance that kept your ancestors alive when predators lurked in the darkness. That joy you get from spending time with friends, that's the same bonding mechanism that held small hunting bands together through impossible odds. That satisfaction from completing a difficult task, that's the same reward system that motivated your ancestors to spend hours chipping stone into perfect tools. We are Stone Age creatures living in a modern world. Every human alive today carries genes that survived 3 million years of natural selection, genes that made it through ice ages and droughts, through predators and diseases, through the worst climate disasters in our species' history. You are the product of an unbroken chain of survivors, stretching back through thousands of generations. Every single one of your ancestors survived long enough to reproduce. Every single one passed on just a little bit of wisdom, just a little bit of genetic advantage that kept the chain going. Think about that. The odds against your existence are astronomical. If one of your ancestors 100,000 years ago had been just slightly slower running from that cave lion, you wouldn't be here. If one of your forebears 50,000 years ago hadn't learned to recognize which plants were poisonous, you wouldn't exist. If even one person in that unbroken chain had failed to survive to reproductive age, the unique combination of genes that makes you who you are would never have assembled. You are the descendant of champions. Every single person alive today is. We're all descended from the same small population of bottleneck survivors. We all carry genes for intelligence that were selected during 117,000 years of near extinction. We all inherited the capacity for cooperation that kept scattered bands connected across impossible distances. We all possess the creativity and adaptability that let our ancestors thrive in environments from tropical forests to Arctic tundra. And the lessons of the Stone Age? They're still relevant. Maybe more relevant than ever. Our ancestors survived because they adapted. When the climate changed, they didn't sit around wishing for the good old days. They innovated. They moved. They figured out new ways to find food, new ways to stay warm, new ways to work together. When things went wrong, and things went wrong constantly, they persisted. They didn't give up when populations crashed to 1,280 individuals. They held on through 117,000 years of crisis until the world became livable again. They survived because they cooperated. Stone Age humans couldn't make it alone. No individual could master all the skills needed for survival. They needed each other. They built networks of kinship and trade that spanned continents. They shared knowledge across generations. They took care of their sick and elderly, their children and disabled, even when resources were scarce. Because they understood something we're still learning. We're stronger together. Most importantly, they survived because they never stopped being curious. For 3 million years, humans kept experimenting, kept trying new things, kept pushing boundaries. From that first Australopithecine who picked up a stone and used it as a tool, to the Upper Paleolithic artists creating masterpieces in cave darkness, to the Neolithic farmers who first planted seeds and waited to see what would grow, our ancestors were driven by curiosity, the urge to understand, to create, to leave something behind. That same curiosity brought you here. You chose to spend hours learning about people who lived millions of years ago, people who never wrote anything down, who left behind only fragments of stone and bone. But their story matters. It's your story, our story, the story of how we became human. If this journey moved you, if these 3 million years of survival and innovation sparked something in your mind, consider leaving a like. It helps other curious minds find this story. It tells the algorithm that deep human history matters, that people still care about where we came from. And drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from. We're scattered across the planet now, just like our ancestors were during the bottleneck, but we're still connected, still sharing stories across distances, still building those networks of knowledge and curiosity that kept humanity alive through the worst times. If you want to support more content like this, YouTube memberships are available, but honestly, the most valuable thing you can do is share this with someone who might appreciate it, someone who wonders about our origins, someone who finds peace in deep time. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember this. You carry 3 million years of survivors within you. Their strength, their creativity, their resilience, it's all encoded in your DNA. You are their legacy, their ultimate success. Every breath you take is proof that they made it, that when everything went wrong, they were tough enough to keep going until the world became livable again. The Stone Age ended thousands of years ago, but it lives on in you. Sleep well, descendant of champions.